Welcome to the PARSE Art&Migration Dialogue Series that has been put together by the editorial team. But let me, before I introduce them, Behrouz Boochani, who will be the first speaker, is just joining us. I will introduce him shortly. Hello, Behrouz. Can you hear us? Yeah. We'll try the video link. If the video link doesn't work, we'll do it by phone. He is at the Mountz Island in Papua New Guinea, and connection is pretty shaky, to say the least. But I will introduce Behrouz better. But first, once again, welcome to this second PARSE dialogue on the topic of art and migration. The dialogue series has been put together by Mahmoud Keshvar's design scholar at Uppsala University, who is sitting over there. Tintin Bulia, who's a postdoc here at the School of Design and Crafts, sitting here in the front. And then it's Nicholas de Genova, who will be joining us shortly, who is a scholar of migration, border, citizen, race, and labor at the University of Houston, and myself, and I'm a professor of design, and I also run, together with two other professors, the PARSE platform, which is a journal and a conference initiative. Before introducing the program of the day, there is a third dialogue on the 29th of April. You see it at the back of the brochure. And confirmed speakers for that is Kitso Lindlelot, a South African artist, the author Alexander Moturi, and the migration scholars William Walters and Martina Tazzioli. So please come back. But first of all, we have a program today. And hopefully you'll have the program, and you can see that we have the honor of having Behrouz Boochani and Arash Sarvestani. Here is Sandro Mezzadra, Charles Heller, Frederikke Hansen and Tone Olafson, Nielsen from Camp Copenhagen and Temple Innocent, Nora Qadim and Alison Mountz presenting here today. They will be presented more properly as they speak. The editorial team has framed the art and migration trajectory accordingly. Over the recent years, we have witnessed a proliferation of new formation of human cross-border mobility, always excluding some combination of autonomous subjective aspiration and desire. We have also seen these social formations of mobility come to be branded as unauthorized, illegalized, and criminalized, which has led to extra-legal infrastructures. It has led to escalation in physical barricades, militarized policing, detention camps, and deportation dragnets, and the making of new technologies of securitization and surveillance. It has also led to the blurring of militarized and policing practices and humanitarian rescue operations. Many of these regimes of bordering are outsourced, issues that today's speakers will give ample evidence of. Consequently, as migration is remaking our world, borders and more diffuse zones of bordering have become key sites of struggle and are overdue for investigation and exposure. Therefore, despite oversimplified discourses regarding the crisis of borders and migrations, these socio-political transformations indisputably signal what is genuinely a crisis of representation. Material, performative, and visual practices configured through various artistic works, design, propositions, textual fictions, cartographical imaginations, and other faculties and sensibilities and other strategies of geopolitical visualization have a vital role to play, not only in honing our critical faculties and sensibilities to the conceptual and effective work of engaging with these issues, but also in providing alternative tools and solutions to the perplexities of mobility and world borders. The PARSE thematic research trajectory focuses on these complex entanglements and specifically wishes to inquire into the embodied, affective, performative, material, visual, and spatial politics of human mobility, and how the material, territorial, and corporeal dimension of border violence and securitization related to migration are experienced or mediated by differently positioned perceiving and sensing bodies. How can words such as migration and migrant, nomad, refugee, which often in the arts are seen as figures of new moralist humanism or universalism, not seldom a redemptive figure, and largely relegated to the question of ethics and contemporary culture, be recuperated and recharged with politics, we ask? Can the role of the arts be something else than that of withdrawal from the political, where the role of the art becomes a never-ending grieving through ethical witnessing of infinite evil? How can the arts and migration studies productively address center periphery issues, in particular the Euro-American centrism, migratory orientalism, and the conflation of south to north and east to west migration representation, still prevalent in many artworks, and the institutional circulation of art addressing migration in Europe and the States, which produces the violence of colonial representation and practices still strongly shaping the practice and our understanding of migration and the migrant. Our hope is that the PARSE-arranged encounters between artists, academics, and civil society groups can work together to challenge new forms of bordering and border violence in ways that are societal as well as intellectually relevant. So, to go to the first speaker, or speakers, the program begins with Behrouz Boochani on link and Kamali Sarvestani. And it is my honor to present Behrouz Boochani and Arash Sarvestani. And Behrouz Boochani is a Kurdish-Iranian writer, journalist, and human rights defender that is still stuck in limbo on the island of Mountz. Last year he published No Friends But the Mountain, which is a remarkable account of the horrific, degrading, inhuman treatment facing those that were imprisoned at the Mountain Island Regional Processing Center until it closed in October 2017. While a critical and erudite account of what he calls a hierarchical prison system, it also depicts the enduring capability of intellectual vigor, human hope, aspiration, desire, and love, despite a system that insistently aims to kill any such dimensions of human aspirations. He has also made the film Shauka, Please Tell Us the Time, together with the filmmaker and video artist Arash Kamali Sarvestani, who has studied film at the Art Academy at the University of Tehran and at the Ritual Academy in Amsterdam. And today you will talk about, after Behrouz has spoken for 15 minutes, about using modern technology to break the isolation of imprisoned migrants. But first I want to welcome Behrouz, and who will start speaking from Mountz. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Can you hear us? We need to, Behrouz, there's something wrong with the sound, we need to adjust it. Just, we need to fix something with the sound, sorry. Då ska det vara på... Can you... Can you try again, Arash?
Can you hear me?
Men om vi disconnectar den.
I can hear you well, and I can see you. Everything is okay in my side, so no problem.
Okay, now it's good.
We hear you.
We hear you.
It's good.
Should I speak?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to say hello to everyone and thank you for attending this event. Should I continue?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. It is a great honor that I am able to talk with you, and thank you for making this happen today. First, I would like to give you some information, basic information. Perhaps some of you asked this question that how I am talking on the phone from Mountz. You know, we have a history of long struggling to have access to internet or technology. For 3.5 years, we didn't have this right to have phone or the internet, so it was completely illegal inside the prison camp. And after 3.5 years, we could get this right to technology through PNG Supreme Court order. The PNG, upon it, we have this right to have phone. So for 3.5 years, we were, completely out of sight and out of mind. Another thing I would like to mention is that they relocated us from the real prison to some new camps, and we are here for, we were in that prison for 4.5 years, and another year in, so still I am living in Hansen with about 600 people. I wanted to give you this information about the technology. So almost 6 years ago, when I found myself in this prison, when they exiled me to Mountz prison, I started to try to find a way to make communication with outside of the world, and I smuggled the phone with the local guards. They brought the phone in for me, and also some of other refugees. But I used that phone and internet to make communication to people in Australia, and I started to establish a network around myself, which was including human rights defenders, journalists, artists, and day by day I have developed my work, I have developed my network, and right now that I'm talking with you, I have a global network, and sometimes I talk attend the conferences, like this conference, from around the world. And I think I could do this through technology. And sometimes I imagine this, that if this prison camp was for 30 years ago, 50 years ago, what would happen for us, and how Australia was, running the prison camp, and could we be, survive after 6 years? And another thing I would like to mention is that we, the main reason they exiled us to this place, and it's like the isolation from the world in this remote island, was that we be outside of out of mind and sight. And that's why for more than 4 years, the journalists and the human rights defenders couldn't reach to this island. And still, journalists, cannot reach to Nora Island. It's really hard because they, prevent people to come here and visit this place and get information. And another thing that I would like to mention is that when we were in that old prison for 4.5 years, they each month or each 20 days or each week, the guards attack our rooms, at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock at morning, and just kick us out of the rooms and the tents and search our properties to find a phone or something like this. And on that time I remember I kept my phone and hid it in my pillow, because it was like a weapon for me. I was struggling against this system like that, and so they attacked they took twice. They could take my phone, and I lost 2 phones, and it is the third phone that I provided. I have. So I have this question that why this system, it was important for this system to prevent journalists and human rights defenders to have access to this place. And why did they send us to a remote island? Because they didn't want and still don't want that people be aware of these prison camps. They don't want to people be aware that how they are treating innocent people. And that's why I think technology has an important role in history of this policy and history of this prison. And I have written my book, a whole novel, 400-page novel only in my WhatsApp, and send it out text by text during years. And also, Arash is here, is among the audience. I would like to say something about Choke Up, Please Tell Us the Time. Choke Up, Please Tell Us the Time was a movie that, I think sometimes I talk with Arash, and we say that it is the most independent, movie in the history of cinema, because we made this movie by just a phone. And even I never meet with Arash, and just we talk, and we have thousands of voices, and we talk, and just it was an amazing collaboration. and just we made this movie on based of understanding each other, and I think we use the technology very well. And as you know, internet is very slow on Mountz Island. Tonight we are very, we are lucky that I am able to talk, but I was very worried over the past few weeks that I won't be able to talk with you, because anytime, internet disconnect, and so that's why I was worried. But with Arash, we made that movie only through WhatsApp and only a phone, and I think it was amazing, because the lack of technology on Mountz Island, I think, help us to make this movie in this way. Sometimes I imagine if the internet would be better, then lack of technology created the space for us that we look at this, made this movie more artistic way.
The connection got bad.
Us. Really, that helped us. And we used to create art. Impossibility, and we are complaining about lack of facilities, or in our work, lack of technology. But we used it, and we created art, and it's hard to explain this, but I am happy that internet in Mountz was very, slow. Yeah. Because if internet was better, this movie was created in a different way. And I think that because and one thing I would like to mention in end is that relate between art and this plight, and also journalism. In my view, that art and literature has an important role in history of this prison camp, because I think journalism language doesn't have this potential that we make people to describe this suffering, this tragedy, and that's why I think we are able to tell this story and describe the life on Mountz Island through art and literature, and that's why I think Choka Crystal's time is going to be a historical role in this dark period, this historical time, and I think Choka Crystal's time is much different with other documentaries that people already made about the Mountz artistic way and the way we look at this prison camp and expose what the Australian government has done on Mountz Island. And another thing is that that I would like to mention is that technology helped us to create the movie and record some shots from inside the prison camp, for the history. That old prison that we made the movie there completely demolished, by the system. When they relocated us to new camps, they demolished that place and they destroyed the prison. So that prison is not exist anymore. Just a little, a small part of the prison remain. But already we recorded, and those shots are, I think, very important in historical way. So I think, I don't know how long did I talk? Maybe it's 16 minutes. So
thank you so much, Behrouz. We will give the word to Arash, and then well, he should hear me. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Arash?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And sorry, you probably didn't hear us clap because the computer, or it was on mute, so you couldn't hear the sound from here. We'll give the word now to Arash, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. But as a segue to Arash, I think it was very interesting to read in your book how you describe how you are struggling to uphold the prisoners, are struggling to uphold dignity, while a lot of the journalists you observe are often trying to find and photograph and document when you are failing to maintain dignity. And I think in your book and also in the film, although you are showing the horrible things that are going on, people are still, they are able to keep their dignity, which I think is a very strong thing in both of your works. So the word over to Arash. Thank you.
First time I see. Okay. Yeah. We talked a couple of times in Sydney and festival in Melbourne. We a couple of times talked via phone live, but this is the first time we saw each other. I don't know how does this work. Yep. So. Okay. Yep. No, I don't know what just here. So, okay. This goes from then questions. Okay. So, talking about Behrouz said lots of things that I wanted to say, but I try to talk more about how we use nanotechnology to break the isolation of imprisoned migrants. First, I'd like to talk about this quote from Rodolphe Walsh. Rodolphe Walsh was a journalist and writer, Argentinian writer, which was executed in a dictatorship time in Argentina. In 1976, in response to censorship imposed by the military dictatorship, Walsh had created ANCIA, clandestine news agency, and the information chain system of hand-to-hand information distribution was leaflet stated in the heading. Produce this information circulated by any means at your disposal, by hand, by machine, by mimeograph, orally. Send copies to your friends, 9 out of 10 are waiting for them. Millions want to be informed. Terror is based on lack of communication. Break the isolation. Feel again the moral satisfaction of an act of freedom. Defeat the terror. Circulate this information. So I can imagine in 1976 how information could go in a dictatorship from someone to other people. It was really, really difficult. And now we are living in a total different time. With internet, with not just in Behrouz said 30 years ago, I believe just 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, that would be much different. Now the technology a bit improved. Now there is really no internet. There was really not internet. I can't imagine how we could communicate sometimes. But with WhatsApp, with these other applications, we could use, and with smartphone, it wasn't just some shots. When you see it in a Sydney Film Festival or London Film Festival, they're really huge. I think it was in Gothenburg Film Festival last year as well, the movie, so I don't know if one of you could watch the movie or not, but really, really big screens, you could see a great picture. So there is not just about internet speed, it's about how you transfer the information and with the new applications and the quality of the picture you can have with such small camera. But yeah, I want to go a bit back before making the short explain something. I was in a workshop of a late Iranian filmmaker, Sarvestani, in 2015, and the theme of the workshop was about the sea. And we should make all the students should make something about the sea. I just don't know, can I go a bit? Okay. Yeah, sorry. Okay, I don't know. We should make something about the sea. I went to the school beside the Mediterranean Sea. I just hope I can make this. Yeah, and then we had to. I just went to the school beside the Mediterranean Sea and asked the kids to talk about the sea. And then they had a really, really beautiful imagination about the sea. And the way back home, when I was going back to the Netherlands, I was all the time thinking, okay, so this is the same sea that people that are coming from North Africa are dying there, and then there is some kids are living in Mountz and Nora because maybe you didn't know it, but because because lots of people that are in Mountz and Nora are Iranian, so some of the Iranian news agencies covered the news. So we heard something about that. Then I said, okay, I have to make something. I have to make something about those kids. And I had the 1-year-old baby, and then I said, it was like, okay, something is wrong. If my daughter would be there, so it would be terrible. Or the parents make the decision, but the kids are the victims. So then I really tried to find some people in the camps. I wanted to go there. I asked for some grant. I didn't get anything. Then I said, okay, I don't need any grant. I just need my phone. Someone's phone, and then just make something there. Then I couldn't find any person. Then I said, okay, even if I can have some voice from them with the phone if I can talk with them. They just say their idea about the city, and I can use it in a video installation. And then I said, okay, I even need an essay, half a page essay from those kids. Then I can go to Melbourne or Sydney and give it to the students in those cities to read the kids' essay, but I couldn't find any person. Then I was really busy with my own commitment that I had to my kids. Sometimes I go back again, went back to see if I can find someone. No, I couldn't. At some point, okay, like I think July 2016, Kiarostami died. Kiarostami died, and I said, oh, I had to make this before he's dead, because I really wanted to talk with him about the movie. Then I started searching again, and I found Behrouz. And that was after the 3.5 years Behrouz talked. I couldn't find him because he was working with Hidden. And then when I came back, I could find him some of his articles in a Guardian. Then I said, I want to make a movie about this camp, and he said, I'm there. But before we go there, I want to say, there are a number of crucial points worth mentioning here regarding the film and the qualities that make it distinct. The film was made by transferring information using up-to-date smartphone technology and WhatsApp. That's funny. You know, before this movie, I didn't have a smartphone. This is my phone. This is still my phone. And I don't use, now I have a smartphone just for making the contact with Behrouz, with WhatsApp. Oh, now I have more WhatsApp, contact, but a personal relationship was formed between two individuals residing in different parts of the world, living in totally different conditions, both with the same goal and using the same new technology. So this is one of the first voice messages Behrouz sent to me.
ببینید اینجا این سرعت اینترنتش بالا پایینه، یعنی من الان یه پیام چیز میفرستم، یه پیام تکست میفرستم، اونم تازه نمیفرسته بعض وقتا 1 ساعت، 1 ساعت، ولی بعض وقتا میشه صدا هم بفرسته. یه بستگی داره چه موقع روز باشه، شب باشه، آخر شب باشه. ولی بخوام فیلم بفرستم عملا امکانش داره، ولی من یه راه دیگه دارم.
So we had this talk from the beginning that, Behrouz said, but at that time, exactly at the time, he was talking about the benefit we got from the lack of internet speed. Exactly at that time, the internet was bad and we couldn't hear what he wanted to say. I believe this was one of the most difficult work you could make because of many problems we had. We were really alone and we had many problems, like the lack of internet speed, the guards that he should be careful with them. He should work with people, and the people they have no hope. So it's not easy for people with that they have no hope to work with them. So other problem was that Behrouz is smart, his ambition, he's creative, but he didn't know how you have to make movies. So he didn't have that profession. So then we had to, the other problem was the time difference. So I remember the best time for internet speed was like really in the morning in Mountz, and then that was late night for us. I have to talk with him. I think for the first 3 months I slept like 3 hours a day because I had to talk between 12 until 3 in the morning with him. And then at 6 o'clock I was awake because my daughter would kick me out of the bed. So then, but this was all gift. What Behrouz wanted to say, he didn't hear me. They were all gift. When you wait for half an hour, for 1 minute 1 minute of voice message, then that voice message is like a gold. It's not just a voice message. When I talk to you now, some people are maybe thinking, oh, I have to go now, or I have this plan, or but when you wait for my message for half an hour, then you listen to it. That was what Behrouz said now. That if we had Skype, if we have this possibility we have, that he have now, we couldn't make Choka. We could make something else maybe something greater. But we couldn't make this movie. This movie, for each shot, we needed really to wait a long time. So that teach me to listen to people, and I think it happened to Behrouz as well. So we were good listener. It was really like gold, but we still didn't think that we can have video. We really, as Behrouz said in one of the first messages, we couldn't send video. We didn't think that we can, because that was a really important point. Else he should take something and then give to someone, and this someone goes to Australia, send it to me, and then I said, what is this? And I tell him, no, this is not good, and then the person go there, and again, it wouldn't work really. Then, so this is I said this is one of the first voice messages.
ببینید من خیلی خوشحالم که بالاخره شما با بارون کیارستمی کار کردید. من دقیقا همون سبک رو تو ذهنمه و فکر کنم همون سبک هم به درد اینجا میخوره و چیزی که تو ذهن منه، البته این فقط تئوری هم، چون عرض کردم من تخصصی ندارم تو این زمینه، هیچ ادعایی هم ندارم، فقط چیزی که برای من مهمه اینه که زندگی برای من مهمه.
This was really important point as well. We both loved one person and his idea about making movie and about the life. Behrouz was in a terrible situation, but he was thinking about life. And in the movie you see many dancing, many kids that are happy, or you see the life. You don't see just okay, you have to see the movie. I can't really explain more, but it was a good point. And this all came from the technology. Two total stranger. As I said, this is the first time I meet Behrouz live. So we always send message, and then two total strangers with the common tastes and common idea. One in the jail, one in the Netherlands, and so they can make something together. But we had, as I said, this is important, I want to say before it's finished, we had problems with video. We didn't know if the video can transfer. But in some point I said to Behrouz, just send something, and Behrouz said, okay, I'm going to send something. We will see how much it takes time. It took a long time, but it arrived. That was so important, because then we could talk really about what we have there, and then I say, okay, I think we should do this, and then we say, no, I think I should do that. This is one of the first shot, maybe the first shot Behrouz sent to me. There was something we could talk, I remember after a couple of shots he said to me, I said, Behrouz, this is great, you're so brave, you're so great, you can do whatever you want, but now you think more about the frame. And that, in this one, you see there is a tree, half of the tree in the frame, half of it is not in the frame, the building, half of it is in the frame, half of it is not in the frame. Just think you are making a painting. So then he did that. This is one of the last shots. See? When the guy is coming in. See, it's like 5 seconds before we see the main, and now the smoke comes. And there is no tripod or so. It's here, like this, moving. these shots in the movie. So, then we could talk about some, then this all came from WhatsApp posts. The quality was really bad, yeah? The quality was really bad. I just start making small edits. I remember, this is so important in 1 minute, I just explain. We made edit. I made like, he sent me like 3 or 4 shots. I edit that 4 shots and I send it back to him via private link. And then I remember I have those voice messages as well. Behrouz watching and said, this is edit, boom, you know, like, it works like that. I can put this shot after that and this one before, and then we got the point. Then he knew, he said, okay, Arash, I'm going to take this shot, you can put it after that one or before this one. And then I think from the first, the beginning to the end, we have 40 versions of edits, from 3 minutes to 90 minutes, and he watched all of them. You know, we talked really closely about everything. So it was really something we made together, and it came with technology, and yeah, we should always find the right person. It's not that easy that I say now, but there is some possibility to make movie in jail, really. And yeah, there's many things I can say about this.
Maybe we can return to some of them later on.
Later, yeah. So, Behrouz, شنیدی تو نمیشتم. خب بهروز من Okay, آقا من برم. So, thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And it's apparent this kind of patience in the film. It was a surprise how quiet actually the film is. I was expecting something else, but it's very quiet and still, you could say, which is an interesting aspect of it. Maybe, I don't know if Behrouz can be here later on for questions when we have, or should we have time for one? We're running a bit late. One quick question would be like, I mean, given that you had to hide your phones, one thing I was wondering is like filming and the risk of being caught filming. How was that?
What risking?
Yeah, was there a risk? I mean, you were not allowed to have telephones, so and you were filming, and
Actually, I forgot to tell you that for more than 2 years, I was working as an unknown source inside the working and making communication. Sometimes they came to me and they were suspicious as me because they had my information about my background, that I'm a writer or I'm a journalist. So they were looking at me in a suspicious way, but they were not sure that I'm working. And so that's why after more than 2.5 years, when I established my network and I have good supporter on the organization or like PEN International, I started to work under my real name. And so that's why the system was always looking at me that I am doing something, So on that time, that I was working on this movie, it was very important that people, first, detainees don't know and don't be aware that I'm making a movie, because inside the prison, that creates some problem for me. The detainees knew, because they were not feel comfortable with that. And
The connection got really bad now, Behrouz.
I'm making a real movie because they, they are making a movie. You should.
The connection got.
Because I can say that most of the shots in this movie are, stolen shots. So I mean, put these shots in, in a way that the guards and the trainees don't know that, I'm taking a shot. So,
Okay.
So, of course, it was risky, but what was important. That's how we made this movie. Yeah. So.
Okay.
Don't think about that.
Okay. Yeah, that's yeah, brave of you. Thank you so much, Behrouz. We need to go to the next speaker. But thank you so much, Arash and Behrouz, for your talk. Okay. To introduce the next speaker is Nicholas de Genova. Welcome.
Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Alison Mountz, who joins us from Canada. She's a professor of geography at Laurier University and also holds a prestigious Canada Research Chair in global migration. Alison Mountz's work encompasses a great variety of topics of interest to our workshop, but has been very specifically focused on the geographies of asylum and detention. Her book, Seeking Asylum, Human Smuggling and Bureaucracy at the Border, was awarded the Meridian Book Prize from the Association of American Geographers. She's also recently published a co-authored book, Boats, Borders, and Bases, Race, the Cold War, and the Rise of Migration and Detention in the United States. Alison is also the editor of Politics and Space, the journal, and was recently a visiting professor at Harvard. So, with no further ado, welcome.
These call to mind motivational speakers. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Magnolia and Tom Cruise's character. It always makes me, this is not my goal. Thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be here and to meet all of you. It's actually my first time being in Sweden and also my first time meeting Nick, with whom I've corresponded and of course have read your work for many years. So I'm looking forward to talking. How do I? Okay. Canada has a long history of providing safe haven for people fleeing violence and war making in the United States, and it's this history that I want to talk to you about today. And in particular, I want to tell you about two recent cohorts of US war resistors migrating from the United States into Canada, and also about the activism, the organizing that fueled and supported their migration, and their engagement with art and the arts. And the project that I'm speaking to you about is actually funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And there are two grants. The first one funded a research program, and the program is called Canada a Safe Haven ? And the second grant funded a film project, and I'm going to show you a small clip of that film as a work in progress, to more broadly, to broader publics be able to mobilize some of the findings of the research. So the reason for the question mark at the end of the title has to do with the idea that it's troubled, it's not always continuous, it's not always for everyone, this role that Canada plays as safe haven. And I think Canada enjoys this kind of mythology that it is a safe haven, but it's important for us to always ask when and for whom is Canada a safe haven, for what reasons and in what times and places. And by looking at these two generations of war resistors and the different outcomes of their search for safe haven, we see why that question mark remains and is something that we always need to keep in mind. So just to tell you a little bit more about the two generations, the first is more broadly known, I think, and that is people coming up during the US-led war in Vietnam. From 1964 to 1973, it's estimated that between 50 and 100,000 people came to Canada. The reason for that variation is that it's believed that about 100,000 came for some period of time, but approximately 50,000 stayed as documented in the census, so became more permanent residents of Canada, which is to say that they by and large found safe haven in Canada. In contrast, the more recent cohort to come during US-led wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was much smaller by comparison. Approximately 300 people, the majority of those underground, never formally declaring themselves in Canada. But there were in that group approximately 50 who made refugee claims. So it's important to note that these two cohorts entered Canada at very different periods of time and different landscapes. Different policy and legal landscapes included. So the first cohort came formally through Canada's points system. They were eventually invited to legalize in different periods of time. How that happened changed over time. But they came as economic immigrants, essentially. Whereas the more recent cohort came through the refugee claimant system. And all of their refugee claims were rejected. And eventually, many of them were deported, and some spent time in military prisons in the United States. A small handful among the 50 were able to stay eventually legally, but it was through humanitarian and compassionate grounds, not through refugee status. So another part of this story, an important part, is the interaction of two generations, the living memory of Vietnam-era resistors and the ways that they are leaders in the war resistor support campaign for the next generation. This story also really exposes, I think, how Canada has changed geopolitically. So here are two brief quotes that kind of embody this. The first from Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, so Justin's father, who famously said that Canada should be a refuge from militarism. And the more recent quote from then Minister of Immigration Jason Kenney, referring to US resistors as bogus refugees. This gives you a sense of how they were being received and a little bit about some of the public discourse surrounding that. Of course, when war resistors, the more recent cohort, were coming, it was under the Stephen Harper administration, so a more conservative leadership that was much more closely aligned politically with US foreign policy. So Canada entered the coalition in Afghanistan, but not Iraq. People often talk about these two cohorts as divergent, and they especially note the issue of conscription, right? So people were subjected to the draft during Vietnam, and many people who fled to Canada identified as draft evaders or draft dodgers. As I said, they came in different political contexts, had very different kinds of resources available to them, and of course a different outcome. But when we look across the generations, which is what the research and the film is doing, we can identify many important parallels in these histories and in people's migration experiences, particularly the near impossibility of getting conscientious objector status, the important role that military recruiters play in bringing people into the military, experiences of flight to Canada, and the broad-based social movements that supported migration. And people talk today about how enlistment works in the US and often use the phrase an economic draft. This is the idea that people who enlist in the military are often doing this as a means to get livelihood, or immigration status, or health insurance, or access to education. And so it encourages us to problematize the idea of choice and the easy divisions between those two generations. So enlistment is highly racialized and classed, and of course no one explanation can encapsulate why people enlist, or in fact why they end up eventually resisting war once they've enlisted. So a lot of what the research and the film aim to do is to tease out some of the complexity of people's decisions and the intersectionality of their experiences. As I said, there were two social movements. They also had a lot in common. Both originated within Toronto, had their headquarters in Toronto, beginning in the 1960s, and then beginning in 2004, when the first Iraq war resistor came to Canada and made a refugee claim. In fact, the contemporary social movement, which has gone on for now 15 years, studied the original political and legal strategies of the earlier campaign, and many of the people who were involved in the earlier campaign became involved in the more recent campaign. They were both based on very broad coalitions of labor, peace, anti-war, faith-based groups who became involved. And also at the heart of this movement were resistors themselves. This is Frank Schauler, who's an incredible activist in Toronto. He was a World War II conscientious objector. Much more common and numerically prevalent were Vietnam-era war resistors involved in the campaign. And they played a very important role in affirming and understanding and connecting with the younger generation, with their counterparts. These were the methods, kind of some traditional social science methods for you of the research. We did archival work looking at particularly at activist histories. And then oral histories were really the kind of heart of this project. So just documenting, collecting oral histories, and asking people to tell their stories in their terms. And this enabled the beginnings of the comparison, and then focus groups literally bring people together to share those stories across the table. But the project also evolved in ways that were not planned originally. And this is what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about. And this was through the collaboration established between the War Resistors Support Campaign and the research project. The campaign in the last few years has been nearing its end. It's about to close up shop and literally close its office in Steelworker Hall in downtown Toronto. And so we worked together to create an archive of that political history. And it's been accepted to be housed in the special collections of the University of Toronto alongside the earlier generation's campaign archives. And all of these kind of ways that the project evolved, the archive, an art show I'll show you in a moment, and a documentary film, really are about the shared belief that, that this is a cycle of war making, and that these generations of searching for safe haven will come again to Canada, and there's this need to inform future generations about these histories and to not forget them. So we worked together to create an art show. The art show wove together two different sources of images. One tells the political history of the contemporary War Resistor Support Campaign, important moments, protests, legal battles, and so on. And the other work is from Just Seeds Collective, which is an artist collective existing across Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and joining different social justice movements. They worked with Iraq veterans against war, who are based in the US, and with the War Resistor Support Campaign in Canada. This is an example of one of the images, and I like it because it references yet another form of art, activism that was going on in the aftermath of people returning from Iraq. And in fact, one of the resistors who's in the film was one of the founders of this thing called Make Drag Not War, which took place in San Francisco and was a collaboration between local drag performers and Iraq veterans against war, and it was really based on the need for people to tell their stories and share their histories in all kinds of ways and outlets. So the third kind of unexpected thing that wasn't planned at the outset was the film, tentatively called Canada, a Safe Haven. And I'm working on this with filmmaker Lisa Malamak, who's based in the US. And we really returned to some of the oral histories that came out of the research to revisit some of the participants and ask if they would go on film to talk. And the film will be, when it's finished, we're working on editing right now, about an hour long. And what it does is it is a collective telling, weaving together these two generations of war resistors, so that you see both the parallels in their histories and also, again, some of the divergent outcomes. We're aiming in the film for as much complexity as we can pack into this hour. Sorry, before I start, let me just tell you a couple things, because you're going to drop, I might need your help too. Back arrow. Okay. So before I drop you into the middle of the stories that you're going to hear, I just wanted to say you're going to hear a few voices over the course of 5 or 6 minutes. And one of them is a guy named Dean, who is an Iraq-era resistor, who did 4 tours in Iraq, and was back in the States. And when his military career finally unraveled, one morning he literally put a Pop-Tart in his toaster oven for breakfast, his morning routine, and decided that was the moment that he packed a duffel bag and walked out to cash out and boarded a Greyhound bus for Toronto. And so the film tells some of his story. And the second longer voice you'll hear in this clip is a guy named Joe, who is Salvadorian American. He came during Vietnam, and he grew up between El Salvador and the US. And Joe was morally opposed to the Vietnam War, but still got drafted into it.
Enlisting in the military was something I always thought about as I was a kid, and especially growing up in Texas. It's a very patriotic place, and you're raised from, the moment you're a kid that, being in the military is an honorable and great thing, and serving your country is something bigger than yourself. I was approached by Army recruiters at the mall, and I was given the whole package about, this is a great way to progress your future. You can get tuition for your college and training for future jobs. And at the time, I didn't really know where I wanted to go after high school, so it kind of caught me at that right time.
When I got to boot camp, I was 18. 3 days later in boot camp, I turned 19. I ran the initial strength test on my birthday. I always thought that was funny and an odd little way to have a birthday. But you learn very quickly in boot camp. You don't tell them stuff like that. You don't say, "Hey, sir, it's my birthday," because you just know they're gonna mess with you that whole day or week.
Went to basic training about 2 months after I graduated, almost right when we got off the bus into basic training, and we were lined up in formation and then getting ready to be issued gear and supplies. I remember one kid fell onto the ground and started going to a seizure actually, and the only thing I remember is instead of calling for help, calling for an ambulance right away, the drill sergeants kind of stood around mocking him, making fun of him, and eventually they did call for help, medical attention, but that experience before they did that sort of really sticks in my mind, and it's basically going against all the values that I'd been instilled with growing up, treat people with basic human decency, and this was a total contrast to all of that. So for me, it was just a process that clicked in right away and just began to snowball.
I arrived in Vietnam, and I was assigned to a platoon in the jungle, about 23 miles, I think it was southwest of Saigon. After a few firefights and seeing the devastation that was occurring, not only to our troops, but to the enemy's troops, and also to the villagers, I couldn't help but conclude that what I was doing was wrong, even though I was a medic, even though I wasn't carrying any kind of firearm, even though I wasn't actually shooting at people. I felt that I was part of the team. And as part of the team, I felt just as wrong morally as everybody else.
I was getting ready actually to get out of the Marines, but they offered me like a huge amount of money to stay put. I was doing pretty well at the time. I think I had just picked up corporal. You know, so everything was going as well as could be expected. And then a friend of mine came around and said, "Hey, what do you think about going to Germany?" I was like, "Well, it seems a little weird. We don't normally go to Germany as Marines, but okay." He had mentioned that we'd be working in a hospital. I was like, "Well, that's even weirder because we don't have medical staff. That's not even our thing." But it turned out they just wanted liaisons between the injured coming in and the hospital staff, somebody that spoke the language between the doctors and the wounded, whoever. So I was like, okay, well, how bad can it be? You know, we're going to go help people, which is awesome. That's kind of, you know, what you want to do with your life. You want to be able to help people. About a month into me being there was a bombing at a tent city somewhere outside of Mosul. Mortar hit this tent city. It was a huge flame from where it initially hit. There were strong prevailing winds that day, and for whatever reason, their waterproofer of choice for their tents is kerosene. So all these tents went up. And so we got a few people that were like military that were like patrolling the town. They would come in first, and then more and more we'd start seeing more Iraqi locals come in, people that had nothing to do with nothing, you know. And so you start seeing the adults come in, and the young adults, and teenagers, and then eventually you get to a point where there's literally busloads of babies coming in from this like all burnt, bloody, you can't tell that they're human beings, some of them. And I became, you know, I zoned out at work, like I wasn't really paying attention, I wasn't visiting the patients like I was supposed to. And eventually the master sergeant in charge took me aside and said, I don't think you're doing too well with this stuff there, son. I was like, you know what, I gotta be honest with you, I don't think I am. You know, I think this is messing me up somehow, and I don't know how it's messing me up, but I'm not sleeping, I'm not eating, nothing seems to matter. At the time I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know there was a name for it, and that's just how ignorant I was of everything.
I went to see the colonel, and I told the colonel the same thing I've been telling everybody else, that I was morally against the war. He thought about it, and he said, well, I will grant you a leave, a 7-day leave. And he said, what are you going to do with it? And I said, well, you know, I'm going to go to Hawaii, you know, I'll ask my parents to come to Hawaii, and, you know, we'll talk. And you know, maybe get my head straight and then come back. I lied. I'm pretty sure you knew I was lying. And he said, all right, I'll grant you the leave. You go to Hawaii, meet your parents, get your head straight, and come back. So I went to Hawaii. I didn't meet my parents there. That was never part of my plan. And I stayed in Hawaii for a while, trying to make myself look like a civilian. And after about 5 or 6 days, I called my parents and told them where I was and that I wanted to come see them. I went to see them, and it wasn't until I got to their house in Alabama that I told them what I had done. So after much talking, we decided that the best place for me to come would be to Canada. I didn't know very much about Canada at all. All I knew was that it was north of the United States.
So, Joe's story, which is told much more fully in the rest of the film, is quite harrowing and involves a series of weird, coincidences and good fortune and harrowing tales of almost not getting in and almost not getting status in Canada. And then he has a really fascinating adulthood and career, becoming a law student and then a judge, and eventually having a really interesting career studying indigenous forms of justice in the north, starting a special court about domestic violence within the province of Ontario. And still others, the younger generation, who are in the film. So you didn't see some of these people, but this is Robin Long, an Iraq war resistor who's actually the first deported from Canada in 2008 and one of the founders of Make Drag Not War. And Robin also has an incredible story. So in the film you hear the longest versions among the subjects of the film of Robin and Joe. And so the film also tracks people who were deported back to the US or who left by choice at some point, including Robin and also Linjamin, who speaks very clearly about the kind of class and racialized reasons why people end up in the military and how he ended up in the army after a period of homelessness, but found himself not willing to go to Iraq, not willing to disrupt other people's livelihoods so that he could survive economically. The film also ends by talking about people's lives to date. So what happened to them once they were in Canada or once they went back to the US, and where are they today? And last year in May, we showed the film A Work in Progress, and we brought many of the people who were in it and part of the campaign in to speak after we showed it. And so we heard those two generations interacting again. They're also behind the scenes and behind the cameras in the film, employed on the project. And so this kind of art emerged from the campaign and is in turn fueling and documenting the histories. And our goal with the film is to bring it to as many audiences as we can, and to make sure that people remember the lessons of the campaign and these recent histories, that people can stand up to the most powerful military in the world, but that it involves organized civil society, incredible activist campaigns across borders, and that although people don't necessarily find formal or legal forms of safe haven, they forge safe haven collectively through these social movements, through the provision of shelter, through the legal challenges that bought time and bought healing time that people carried back to the US to deal with their punishments that were meted out to them. So Robin, for example, has a son in Canada, but when he was deported was banned from re-entering Canada for 10 years, and then in the US was sent to military prison for just over a year. He views all of his work as healing from what happened to him. As I said, in making the film and in doing the research and creating the archive, we really share with the campaign this belief that Canada always has the potential to be a safe haven, but that safe haven is not something that we can ever take for granted. We have to be vigilant and fight for safe haven. And another, I think, really important thing that I've been learning as a migration scholar, working with war resistor migrants, is to remember how deeply entangled so much migration is with war. They're deeply intertwined, and we can think of mass migration itself as a collective resistance to war, a collective forging of safe haven. And while most people don't necessarily think of US citizens or soldiers as refugees or asylum claimants, they intersect through this war making with other groups of people displaced by those very wars that they are participating in or resisting participating in. And so it's important for us to remember that they're not equivalent in any way, but they are interconnected in ways that we can learn from. Thank you.
So we just have a few minutes to start with some possible questions. I just wanted to ask you to say a bit more about the point that you ended with, which is how you see this project in relationship to previous work, and more thematically how you think about war resistor migration in particular as a kind of asylum seeking. As a way to just open it up, but hopefully we'll have a few minutes.
Sure. I mean, in some ways, of course, US soldiers who are war resistors have very different stories. In some ways, they're very privileged migrants, particularly moving from the US into Canada, through language and other things, cultural identity, cultural markers, they can pass pretty quickly underground in Canada. And then in other ways, when I work with war resistors, I often think, oh, right, this is, they're precarious in ways that all new immigrants, newcomers are. Difficulty in not having their cases established for years, and therefore not having access to education, not having access to the labor market in any sustained fashion, kind of hedging their bets and moving around and sharing resources. And I think they learned from that too and found a lot of common cause with other newcomers and refugees in Canada. And that was an important part of the War Resistor Support Campaign, which was this coming together of people from all different walks of life, who I think through this work also learned about migration and refugee issues. And so I think, so that's a way of answering that there are many important ways that they intersect and also diverge too.
Are there other questions or comments?
Just a simple question. Hi, thank you. What happens to people if they stay in the U.S.?
What happens if people
If they stay in the U.S.? So what are the consequences for people who resist war but they still want to stay in the U.S.?
In the U.S., usually imprisonment. I mean, it depends. During this period of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, rates of desertion have been climbing rapidly. So there are far more people who've deserted and who live underground than the US government is interested in tracking and arresting. So they're at threat of arrest, and they have all kinds of problems in terms of hiding. But until they become sort of known for some reason, they aren't necessarily imprisoned. And there are all kinds of stories as well about people who went to Canada and the decisions they made about how to go back, whether to try to be underground in the US or present themselves back to the military. And in fact, Joe did that. Eventually, there was an amnesty in the US for people who had fled Vietnam. And so there are a lot of stories of people years later going back to the US to legalize their status, but having to therefore re-enlist in the military and go into the stockade and have it be shaved, to step back into the uniform after years of having rejected being part of the military.
Is there anyone else?
We'll have dialogue later, right?
Yeah. So, thank you, Alison.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay. The next speaker is Charles Heller. We're honored to have him here. Charles is a researcher and filmmaker whose work has long-standing focus on the politics of migration. He's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Graduate Institute Geneva. Charles is known for the work he did together with Lorenzo Pezzani in 2011 when they co-founded forensic oceanography as part of Forensic Architecture Project, a collaborative project that has developed innovative methodologies to document the conditions that lead to migrants' deaths at the sea. Heller and Pezzani have also launched the Watch the Med platform, a tool enabling non-governmental actors and activists to exercise a critical right to look at the EU's maritime frontiers. They have co-authored various reports and articles and have exhibited their work internationally, including the Venice Biennale, MACBA, MoMA, ICA, and Manifesta 2012. Please join me in welcoming Charles Heller.
Hi everyone, you can hear me? I'm very happy to be here. I'm not very used to these kind of microphones, but I'll get used to it in a second. What do you think, Alison? Very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Maybe since I'm in a school of design and art, let me stress as well as was just said that I'm initially trained as an artist and filmmaker, where I studied art in the Fine Arts School in Geneva. And well, in fact, since 2003, 2004, when I started working with asylum seekers in Geneva, research, activism, and aesthetic practice, let's say broadly, have been inextricably linked to each other. And subsequently, I went to study at Goldsmiths, where I led a PhD in research architecture, without myself ever being trained as an architect. And with my colleague Lorenzo Pezzani, we initiated forensic oceanography in 2011. What I'm going to do today is run you through a series of projects that we've undertaken since then and try to describe the shifting position that we try to adopt in relation to changing political contexts, but also inextricably aesthetic contexts. And maybe also to, just before I go into that, say the work that we produce, as you might realize from the brief description with which I was introduced, often we produce a report rather geared at the human rights context. We also develop tools for activists, and based on these reports, we produce videos and maps which kind of synthesize our reconstructions, and these visual elements can be circulated quite broadly online in the media, but also in art contexts. And of course, on the basis of our research, we also produce rather academic articles intersecting with different disciplines. Sorry, something seems to have gone a bit wrong in the printout of this map. But anyway, this is a map produced by Mezzadra, which shows the scale of deaths at the maritime frontiers of Europe. In fact, as you probably know, there have been more than 30,000 documented deaths at the maritime frontier since the end of the 80s, and many more clearly have been not recorded. Now, these deaths really become structural at the same time as illegalized migration becomes a structural feature of the European border regime when increasingly restricted visa regulations are imposed on migrants from the global south. Now, the majority of these deaths not only die at sea, but through the sea. Most of these people have died drowning. The sea has become the liquid terrain of a mobility conflict, which has resulted in the perpetuation of a deeply hierarchized and segmented mobility regime, speedy and secure for certain goods and privileged passengers, slow and deadly for the unwanted. Water, in this context, is turned into a deadly liquid that inflicts violence in indirect ways, mediating between state policies and practices on the one hand, and the bodies and lives of migrants on the others. The liquid element has been weaponized within the mobility conflict, enabling a form of killing without touching. This indirect form of violence is difficult to perceive as such, and legal responsibility for it is difficult to assign. Making both these elements emerge has precisely been the aim of our project, Forensic Oceanography. To contest the violence of border, however, we have to contest the borders of what could be seen and heard at the maritime frontier. We have to contest the aesthetic regime imposed by states on the maritime frontier. Now, we understand aesthetics here in a rather Rosserian sense of conditions of appearance and disappearance, conditions of audibility and inaudibility. In short, a form of partition of the sensible. As a result of their illegalization, migrants who seek to contest their banishment from European space have to resort to clandestine strategies of border crossings. These have a highly aesthetic dimension. In fact, as the very etymology of the term clandestine indicates, clandestine etymologically means hidden. In turn, what state agencies that seek to detect, control, neutralize the threat of illegalized migration seek to do is shed light on their acts of unauthorized border crossing. Here you have a slide showing the surveillance apparatus that is assembled through different sensing means. This ambivalent and selective regime of in/visibility is reproduced as well in the field of images. As you know, there have been countless images of boats being intercepted by border or coast guards, images that have become practically interchangeable. In fact, some of these images migrate from article to article over many years. They have become floating images, perpetually displaced like the subjects they depict. However, images of border violence are most commonly kept hidden. This image, for example, which is the only image, photographic image that we could access of the trajectory of what is known as the left dive boat, which I'm going to describe in more detail in a second. This is the first case that we actually worked on in 2011, which is a boat that left the shores of Tripoli in the direction of Lampedusa at the end of March 2011, just as a NATO-led military intervention had been deployed at sea. And despite repeated interaction with several state actors, they were left to drift for 14 days in NATO's maritime surveillance area, and as a result, only 9 of the 72 passengers initially embarked on this rubber boat survived. To try and intervene in this partition of the sensible, we try to seize upon means, remote sensing means usually used for border surveillance, and redirect their light towards the violence of borders. On the other hand, we sought to inscribe the traces of those events within the maritime frontiers, unbundle sovereignty, to use Saskia Sassen's term. So again, the first case that we worked on was the Leftadai boat case, which I'll just describe very briefly here. As you see, we relied on survivor testimonies, very detailed testimonies of the events that they lived through and that had imprinted itself forever on their memory. But also relied on distress signals containing georeferenced data that allowed, if you will, to anchor the events in space and time. And we also relied on the help of an oceanographer who reconstructed the vessel's drift as of the moment the boat ran out of fuel. And finally, as we knew that we knew the boat's position during those 14 days of drift, we knew that all vessels in the area had been informed of its distress. The question became, where were the warships deployed within the NATO-led military intervention? And to try to answer that question, we relied on satellite imagery. And all of those little white points are large vessels of more than 75 meters, several of which must be military. Through these different means, we reconstructed the vessel's entire trajectory, and our report was the basis for a legal case against several of these states, which is in fact still ongoing, despite having been initially filed in 2011, 2012, and 2014. Cut to October 2013. Many of you remember, I'm sure, the 3rd of October shipwreck, less than 1 kilometer off the coast of Lampedusa, which cost the life of more than 360 people. This shipwreck caused a public outrage. And it was that incident, as well as another less well-known incident on the 11th of October 2013, which led us to develop with the Watch the Med network the Alarm Phone project. The Alarm Phone project emerged out of the urge not only to reconstruct past cases of violations, in particular cases of non-assistance, but to seek to intervene in real time and prevent those violations from occurring. Through the Alarm Phone, we were basing this operational mode, if you will, on the long-standing work of Father Césaire, who had been operating, if you will, a single-handedly a rescue agency or an alarm phone agency. And through our network, we sought to collectivize the practice that he had been operating since a number of years. But these shipwrecks also signal deeper transformation at the maritime frontier. And in particular, the consolidation of what William Walters, in fact, has called the humanitarian border. We like, in fact, rather than to speak of the humanitarian border in the singular, to think in more processual terms of a process of humanitarianization, and as you will see, dehumanitarianization of the border. And you can see this very clearly illustrated through this image. These are the coffins of the passengers whose bodies had been fished out of the water in the 3rd of October shipwreck. But immediately, it was also transformed into a production studio. And in front of those coffins, European policymakers announced that they deplored those deaths, and that to prevent those deaths, they had to double the budget of Frontex and launch Eurosur, the European surveillance, border surveillance system. In that sense, migrants' deaths were no longer kept in the shadows, they were being spectacularized. and used to justify border control within a humanitarian discourse. However, in the process, what was being lost was the connection between migration policies and migrants' deaths. This is what we sought to reconnect, if you will, through our next project, which concerned the rise and demise of the Mare Nostrum operation. I'll go again quite quickly over this, but Mare Nostrum was the operation that the Italian state single-handedly launched, a humanitarian and security operation, which was a distinct break in the logic of reluctance to operate rescue and the logic of non-assistance that had predominated until then. Through military means deployed close to the Libyan coast, Italian assets rescued proactively migrants and disembarked them by default on Italian soil. That operation clearly was not sufficient to bring migrants' deaths to an end. After all, if the operation was decried as a halfway bridge for migrants by the Italian far right, it was precisely only a halfway bridge. The illegalization of migrants continued, and migrants kept dying in that stretch of sea between Libya and their eventual rescue. What bothered European policymakers, however, was not so much that migrants were dying, but rather that more migrants were arriving safely on European shores, and for many of them, continuing northwards through Western and Northern Europe in contravention to the Dublin regime. And so, when Italy asked to Europeanize Mare Nostrum, European policymakers politely or impolitely denied it. This is time? Or what does this sound? I don't know. And they replaced Mare Nostrum operation with the smaller scale and border control oriented Operation Triton. This, as many human rights activists and even UN agencies had predicted, did not lead to a decrease in migrants' crossings, but rather in a staggering increase in the number of deaths at sea, as well as in the mortality rates. These shipwrecks in April 2015 also coincided with the shift in migrants' collective trajectories towards the Aegean, which they crossed massively over the summer of 2015, which we labeled the Summer of Migration. Summer of Migration, however, if it was the peak in migrants' capacity to overcome European borders in this sequence of reopening of the maritime frontier that followed the Arab uprisings, was also the beginning of a violent rollback, a phase of dehumanitarianization of the border regime. Following the near closure of the Aegean route between Turkey and Greece, in particular by turning Greece into an open-air prison and signing an agreement with the Erdogan regime, the attention moved back to the central Mediterranean. And there, Italy deployed what we have called the Mare Clausum operation. This is an operation which had not been named, contrary to Mare Nostrum, Triton, Poseidon. Policymakers have found countless and very imaginative labels for their operations, but for some strange reason, they hadn't labeled the operation that aimed to seal off the Mediterranean, central Mediterranean in particular, by criminalizing rescue NGOs and outsourcing border control to the Libyan Coast Guard. And what we see here is a phase of dehumanitarianization, in the sense that on the one hand, humanitarian actors have progressively been nearly expelled from the maritime space, in the sense that security operations like EUNAVFOR Med, the remnant of humanitarian logic that was still ingrained in them was progressively pushed to the side. And finally, as you will see, in this phase, the lives and the deaths of migrants are, it seems, have lost even symbolic value. It's no longer even necessary to gesture towards them to justify European policies of closure. This has been the focus of our work over the last 2 years, where on the one hand, we've sought to support rescue NGOs to counter the discourse of delegitimization and criminalization. I'm just going to go very, very fast through this. And for example, mention the case of the Juventa. There is a particular reconstruction concerning the Juventa, the boat of the German NGO Jugendrettet that was seized on the 2nd of August 2017, based on allegations of collusion with people smugglers. Those allegations resort to a strategy which we have called factual lies. As you see in this image, it starts from discursive or symbolic elements that have a factuality to them, like a photograph. And based on these elements, these scattered elements, it weaves a narrative which is completely false and intentionally false, and very simply amounts to a lie. So through our work, we have offered counter-reconstructions of the events for which the NGOs were accused of collusion. On the other hand, we've focused on the other dimension of what we call the Maritime Operation, the outsourcing of border control to Libya, in particular through the Sea-Watch versus Libyan Coast Guard case, a case in which the rescue NGO Sea-Watch was involved in a conflictual rescue operation in which it succeeded in rescuing about half the passengers, but the other passengers were captured and brought back to Libya, where several of them underwent torture and other forms of ill treatment. This was also the base. Our reconstruction of the Juventa case is included in the court case against it and in its defense. And this report and the video that we've produced as well with forensic architecture has been the basis for a legal case against Italy, launched on the 8th of May 2018. However, just after that case was launched, you know that legal processes take time, but you hope that they have some kind of that they can act as an incentive for states to stop breaking the law, right? That they put them under pressure. But just after we launched that case, Matteo Salvini was instated as the new Interior Minister of Italy. And he, in fact, only further heightened this policy of closure through criminalization, outsourcing, and also the closure of Italian ports, which has resulted in standoffs for each and every rescue, increasing interceptions by the Libyan Coast Guard, new cases of non-assistance since seafarers of all sorts try to refrain from rescue, as this will mean that they risk being held hostage, if you will, in a standoff between European states refusing to disembark the migrants. And finally, repeated cases of what we call privatized pushback, in which merchant ships are tasked with rescue, but then tasked with bringing the migrants back to Libya in violation of their obligation of non-refoulement. This image, taken on the 3rd of October 2018, somehow epitomizes for me this moment of dehumanitarianization of the border. This is the 3rd of October, the ceremony marking the commemoration in honor of the 368 victims of the Lampedusa shipwreck. In the prior years, it had always been attended by high-level representatives of the Italian state. This year, however, it was only attended by Lampedusa's mayor. No representative of the new Italian government made the effort and considered that it was symbolically valuable to attend that ceremony. A few days ago, Matteo Salvini made a minor gesture, somehow indicating that a little bit of the humanitarian dimension of the border remains in justifying the success of his policies in terms of less decreasing number of deaths at sea. However, in fact, these very figures are revealing, on the one hand, they're simply false. There are several hundred more migrants who died between those 2 years. And in fact, even if there are less deaths in 2018, simply because many fewer people arrived on Italian shores, the danger of crossing itself has staggeringly increased. Now, in this context, and if I have a few more minutes, I'll conclude on that. I think this context of dehumanitarianization of the border poses, distinct challenges to our operational modes, to what we seek to reveal and how we seek to contest policies. I would say that while we must continue to contest the policies that turn the sea into a deadly liquid, strategic litigation should at least be attempted to contest the collaboration with the Canadian Coast Guard, the criminalization of NGOs, and the closure of ports. Clearly, litigation is not enough. We need, I would argue, both to continue through many different means our hand-to-hand struggle with the border, but also and simultaneously to zoom out, if you will, and address the broader relational field that leads to the reproduction of the mobility conflict. And I would outline at least 2 dimensions in which I think this is really necessary. A first one is that one issue that we are facing, I think, at present, is that border violence is considered a necessary evil. It seems to have gained an extraordinary consensus, as even the more or less humanist center believes that because of migrants, the far right is gaining ground, thus strengthening the neoliberal order. The consensus, it seems, is that their suffering is the necessary condition for our well-being. If we want to succeed in contesting border violence, I think we urgently need to contest the different ways in which this us and them is constructed, emphasize commonality between migrants and citizens. And this is also the condition to forge transversal struggles. Another dimension in which I think it's essential to zoom out, if you will, while we still remain very much anchored and specific in terms of contesting border violence, is to locate border violence as one moment in the multiple forms of violence that mark migrants' entire trajectories, starting from the economic and political violence in migrants' countries of origin, with which Europe is deeply imbricated, both historically and in the present. If we do not, we risk reproducing the forms of occlusion of the border spectacle, even as we seek to contest it. Located in a broader field of uneven relations between Europe and the global South, we can better perceive the questions of global injustice that are at stake in the tensions surrounding migration and borders. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Ross. It's a wonderful presentation. I have one question that you passed very quickly when you were talking about the alarm phone project. A few years ago, I was listening to Hagen, one of the activists behind the project, together with you, and it was amazing how much transnational labor and organization it requires to launch this type of practices. And this is quite opposite to majority of humanitarian art and design projects, kind of flooded into humanitarian market after 2015 that tend to solve the issue with an app or a product, whatsoever. That even in the case of a couple of these apps for helping migrants to kind of find their way, they see they were fake even though they received humanitarian awards, but the apps itself never worked. So one of the issues that, you didn't mention, but both in your work, forensic oceanography, but also the alarm phone, that's the activist side of it, this amount of labor and time that one needs to put if one needs to work with practices mediating aesthetic practices related to politics of justice practiced by migrants and refugees. So just an elaboration on that.
Sure, thanks a lot for the question. Maybe a first element here is that it's interesting for me also to think of the way different strategies become more or less useful in different moments and in relation to different shifts of the war duration. For example, strategic litigation was pretty much useless during the summer of migration because it's a rather defensive strategy. And this was an affirmative moment of transgression. And during that moment, precisely, the alarm phone, which had actually started as a project 6 months before, suddenly had a staggering curve in its development. It was receiving 20, 30 calls every night during summer 2015. And the alarm phone is a really interesting case for us because we did initially develop the methodology that I described towards strategic litigation, so a very particular tradition of political activism. But soon, and through the alarm phone, it was seized towards another tradition, that which we might describe as the underground railway. And in this tradition, in fact, it's, how should I say, the alarm phone as a tool only becomes operative if and as it has been successful in inscribing itself, first of all, in migrants' transnational networks, right? Their knowledge of circulation that is forged collectively through their very movements, right? And here our friend Mezzadra has worked a lot on this. But also, as it is inscribed through our transnational network of activists. But with the rollback of the border and less satellite phones being provided to migrants leaving from Libya as of 2016, the alarm phone was progressively, if you will, almost obsolete for a year or so. For a year or so, phone calls drastically diminished. And now, over the last year and a half, with crossings in the Western Mediterranean, which have increased importantly, and as a result of the very long-term work that the alarm phone had conducted in Morocco to build connections and networks within migrants' communities living over there, the alarm phone has become once again an absolutely essential tool in the Western Mediterranean, and also right now in the Central Mediterranean once again, when satellite phone calls are picking up again, but also in a moment where rescue NGOs have basically been expelled from the space close to the Libyan shores. And the disobedient listening operated by the alarm phone becomes an essential way to operate a critical right to look.
Any question? There.
Don't worry about the microphone, I think. Hi. So I hail from the US-Mexico borderlands. This has a lot of resonance with me, of course, and I'm a great admirer of you and Eyal's work. I'm curious about what you envision sort of an end result of these projects being. They get so much circulation, you know, through The Guardian, through the New York Times, the circulation of images like you were talking about. But I'm curious, is bringing the Italian government to the ICC sort of part of the end result? Or like, what do you envision a solution being truly to this problem? Do you know what I mean? Like in terms of persecuting those who are in the wrong, because it seems as though the court cases come up and then they kind of fade, or you know, there are activists who are being charged and their lives are ruined forever, but in the meantime the politicians press on. And so I'm just curious what the trajectory is with tracing these wrongdoings and holding people accountable is. It's very broad, I'm sorry.
Thanks. So 30 seconds to chart an alternatives for you know, I would say first of all, within, or at least initially in the forensic architecture project, the aim was not to define a new perfect mode of intervention, but rather to experiment with this mode of intervention and also reflect on the limits of that mode of intervention. So clearly I still see strategic litigation as an important form of intervention which should be pursued, even if it is time-consuming, even if it is, even if it actually, none of the cases so far have been successful. But I'd say that strategic litigation isn't only won or lost in courts, right? Strategic litigation also operates through the broader public sphere, public debates, policy circles. And I have difficulty in thinking that the work that we did was contributed to nothing in, let's say, the humanitarianization, right? That phase of humanitarianization of the border, which, insufficient as it is, was nonetheless an important evolution. But I'd say, you know, very simply that for us, strategic litigation, and more broadly, you know, strategic litigation is framed within a discourse and practice of human rights. And for us, human rights is not an end in itself, right? It's a tactical tool which needs to be resorted to for its capacity for intervention, but also we clearly need to step out of it for its insufficiencies. So in that sense, from our perspective, there is no other way to end deaths of migrants at sea than a migration regime founded on the reality of migrants' freedom of movement. A reality, an already existing reality that states seeks to contain, deny through their policies. But while we can acknowledge that reality, while we can try to support it through the alarm phone, for example, while we can try to enable more freedom of movement, there is no doubt that a fundamental policy change is very simply not on the agenda right now. And so I would say that we need to continue our hand-to-hand struggle with the border to undermine border violence and enable more freedom of movement, but also reflect strategically towards what means and processes and alliances might actually lead to the institution of a right to international mobility. That was a challenging one.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'm sure we'll go back to some of these issues in the discussion today.
Hello everyone, hello again. I'm delighted to introduce to you Frederikke Hansen and Olaf Nielsen, co-founders of CAMP, the only art center in Europe with a continuous artistic focus on migration that has been awarded several prizes and acknowledgements. The two have been working together in a curatorial collective called Kuratorisk Action on projects on decolonization, focusing on the Nordic region since 2005. Frederikke Hansen is currently the creative director of CAMP. Olaf Nielsen is now a consulting program director of CAMP and also program director of Trampoline House, an independent community center in Copenhagen that provides refugees and asylum seekers in Denmark with a place of support, community, and purpose, aiming to break the social isolation and sense of powerlessness that many refugees and people seeking asylum experience in the Danish asylum system, which they will also introduce in their talk. Frederikke and Tone, a warm welcome to our PARSE dialogue, and I'll hand the stage over to you.
Thank you, Tintin, and Rose, Mahmoud, and Erling, and everybody else in PARSE for having made our participation possible. In our presentation today, we hope to show you how CAMP, which stands for Center for Art and Migration Politics, uses art and curating to respond to the so-called refugee or migration crisis, and how we are trying to build a mutually empowering bridge between those of us who have been subjected to forced displacement and those of us who receive them. In order to do that, we first have to talk briefly about Europe and the Danish asylum system, and introduce you to another ongoing project responding artistically and curatorially to the challenges of racism, displacement, and migration. That is the project called Trampoline House. In 2015, more than 1 million refugees and irregular migrants crossed into Europe, cutting open the continent's borders and creating divisions amongst its politicians and populations over how to deal with the influx. Fearing that newcomers will strain our welfare systems, threaten security, and undermine the so-called quality of European life, European governments have responded by fortifying their external borders and reforming their asylum and deportation laws. Consequently, Europe is now the world's most dangerous migration route, and the Mediterranean the world's most dangerous border crossing, according to IOM, the International Organization for Migration. The large migratory and refugee flows have resulted in a whole migration management industry, juridical and political procedures and technologies that contemporary nation states and private contractors use to try to regulate transnational migration and to exclude unwanted migrants. Of the 1.3 million refugees reaching Europe in 2015, 21,225 made it all the way to Denmark and applied for asylum. Out of those, only 10,573 had their asylum case processed in Denmark. The rest were found to have no valid asylum claim and were forcibly deported to their home country or were sent back to other European countries to have their cases processed there, according to the so-called Dublin Regulation. This regulation, as you very well know, means that asylum seekers are obliged to apply for asylum in the first EU country they arrive in, and that the decision of this country is the final decision in all EU countries. In comparison, Sweden received 63,000 applications for asylum in 2015 and processed 59,000 cases. So 21 and 163,000. People who seek asylum in Denmark or have been denied asylum and are waiting to be deported are not allowed to work, enroll in an education program, or to live where they want. Instead, most of them are accommodated in remote asylum centers scattered across the country while they wait for the authorities to settle their asylum case. In 2015, Immigration Service also established a number of deportation centers to accommodate rejected asylum seekers only. Some wait months, others several years, depending on the specifics of their case or the pressure in the asylum system. But all asylum center and deportation center residents share the same burden, not knowing how long you will have to stay in the asylum center system, as there is no maximum application processing time or no time maximum for how long you can reside in one of the deportation centers. The asylum centers are run by the Danish Red Cross or by individual municipalities, while the deportation centers are prison-like facilities run by the National Police. 19% of all people living in the asylum centers are pending asylum cases with Immigration Service. 51% are waiting to come before the Refugee Appeals Board, and 16% are in rejected or deportation phase. Centers open and close depending on the number of asylum seekers arriving in Denmark. In January this year, the number of centers had dropped to 25, accommodating an estimated 5,250 people. The government aims at reducing this number even further to only 19 centers by next month. These measurements, however, are not reflecting a decrease in numbers of people forcibly displaced. Instead, these and other austere measurements are reflecting an asylum and migration policy deliberately designed to make people of non-Western origin, particularly Muslims, stay away from Denmark by reducing the life quality of those who did come here to seek asylum or work to a bare minimum. According to Danish art historian Mikkel Bolt, the Danish asylum centers are literal camps, and the measurements reflect, and I quote, a system of forced social disintegration designed to keep the undesirables on the outside at all costs. Trampoline House Refugee Justice Community Center was formed in 2010 by artists, curators, asylum seekers, and migration activists in reaction to the way in which the Danish state treats asylum seekers and refugees. Trampoline House offers internships and job training, legal, medical, and psychological counseling. We offer various classes and social activities for asylum seekers and refugees with a residence permit. The house grew up out of a socially engaged art project, and today it is a large permanent organization with 12 staff members, 20 educational interns, 90 volunteers, and 350 asylum seekers and refugees in internships annually. The purpose of the house is to break the social isolation and sense of powerlessness that most asylum seekers and refugees with residency are experiencing, either while waiting for asylum or forced removal in one of the asylum or deportation centers, or while they're going through Denmark's 3-year integration program.
We decided that I should do the camp bit, but I can just stand here and meditate while you do it. I enjoy it.
We switch.
Yeah, Tona and I have been working together since 2005, so we're the two-headed monster. But as we also had two different bodies, we decided to switch. So as Tintin said, we've been working together as the curatorial collective, Kuratorisk Aktion, or Curatorial Action, since 2005, and have for the first 9 years of our collective practice engaged Scandinavian colonialism with global decolonial art and activism. This work has led us to conceive, raise funds for, and in the spring of 2015, open up CAMP, Center for Art and Migration Politics, which is a small international art center located in the heart of Trampoline House, and with a thematic focus on professional contemporary art that makes the human and societal challenges posed by migration both present and relatable. So we'd like to try to address what role art can play in contributing to the discussions on social political issues, such as the so-called refugee crisis, with showing you some impressions from our first thematic exhibition series that we called Migration Politics, which consisted of 6 exhibitions in camp and a number of commissioned exhibitions and events in other institutions. Now, Indian writer Arundhati Roy once wrote that we should not leave it to the experts to explicate our contemporary world of capitalist globalization. And by experts, she meant politicians, bureaucrats, the media. She claimed that that job had to be carried out by artists, that they are able to unpack the complex causes, workings, and effects of capitalist globalization to ordinary people like me, us ordinary people, who feel its effects directly in our lives and on our bodies, in such a way that we can understand them and take action. Our globe is currently facing a series of catastrophic crises that the international community has been unable to tackle. Climate change, unequal wealth distribution, extremism, terrorism, and mass migration, to name some of them. In such a world on fire, the primary responsibility of public institutions, political, social, and cultural, is to provide platforms where these crises can be unpacked and discussed across boundaries of differences, so that civil society, majority as well as minority communities, are included in these discussions on how to address them, so that we can collectively begin to discuss how to solve them. Our state, public and private art institutions should find the courage to open up their programs and collections for artists and cultural producers who have taken it on them to unpack our contemporary crises from the perspective of those who are hit the hardest by them. In other words, we need museums and art galleries to make room for artworks that deconstruct white privilege and structural racism, so that the community members who feel marginalized and silenced are heard and taken into account. There is no thing such as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard, Arundhati Roy has also said. So in short, we need our art institutions to generate shared spaces, spaces that we inhabit and develop across boundaries of privilege and inequality. And CAMP is one attempt to provide such a platform. In CAMP, we believe that art engaging migration politics is able to express life experiences of migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, and place their testimonies within a larger political and historical perspective. Migration-engaged art mirrors not only the precariousness of migrants and refugees, but also shows the social richness, creativity, dignity, and strategies of resistance, by which these groups of people survive in a world that does not want them and fight back. Art and migration politics sheds light on what affects us all, yet the migrant and the refugee the most: home, close relations, personal safety. In the end, it also contributes to a lived critique of the political systems that uphold discriminating borders, global economic inequality, and non-sustainable exploitation of our nature. As part of CAMP's new exhibition format, Camp Focus, we have launched a new 2-year exhibition program titled State of Integration, Artistic Analysis of the Challenges of Coexistence. And we launched that last fall with an exhibition called Decolonizing Appearance, guest curated for camp by visual theorist and activist Professor Nicholas Mezzadra. It's quite a success, so we've extended it in case you have the opportunity to come to Copenhagen. Please look up camp. Of course, you would also look up Trampoline House at the same time. And come and see the exhibition. We would like to end by just showing a short clip, a video made by Boochani on the exhibition. Haha, something happened in the transfer. Is there? So maybe I just hit the space bar? Nope. No. Got it? Yeah.
That connect us and how we...
Are you ready? Yes. No. Now it's
Decolonizing appearance seems like a complicated thing, but it really isn't.
Marriage is to see the spaces where we can heal our wounds together, both the ones we have been dealt and those we have inherited. No matter how heavy the oppression, you cannot deprive people of their hopes and dreams of freedom.
We used the workshop of banner making to begin a conversation about what freedom looks like and what are the differences that we have and how can we not necessarily come together but understand the structures of oppression that connect us and how we are complicit in them. And from there, through art and through conversations, take action. But that's not what we're involved in, right? So one of the things that we said is like, okay, we can imagine a movement that understands this is thinking where we stand.
What kind of art exhibitions do we need then? Do we just need things that are put on the wall? Or like how do those things, what is the process of those things being put on the wall? And so, or what is accounted for art and what is not accounted for art, who speaks, all of these things. So I think there's a lot of questions, but I think that positively something will come out of all of this.
Everybody wanted to interview me. I didn't want to be on the camera because I'm not a citizen. I don't want to be part of that. But how many times, just because representation is important, but which also leads to tokenization, right? So people might have their heart in the right place, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the correct outcomes.
Temporary house has been building space for all the refugees who are living in Shazman. But what is the government doing?
أنا اسمي حبشي من فلسطين، محافظة بيت لحم مخيم عايدة، وأنا يعني مناصر للناس اللي تطلب الحرية.
Nearly 300,000 Danish people, or about 10% of the entire population of Denmark at that time, moved to the lands that were in the process of becoming the United States and Canada. And yet when we talk about colonialism, when we talk about the US as a settler colonial state, there's no understanding of the extent of European populations who are complicit in the establishment of the US as a settler colonial state.
Change the way, or change the frame within which the discussions of citizenship occurred. And from the research that I was doing, I was able to bring a new perspective to the conversation and to have people think about, well, what does it actually mean to be British if we took the histories of colonialism seriously and not just thought about Britain as a nation, which is an absolute fallacy. Britain's never been a nation, it's always been an empire.
Thank you, Frederikke and Tone, for your presentation of camp and a bit of trampoline house. Any questions? Yes.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the presentation. This may sound like a strange question, but I'm interested to know if there is a curatorial policy, or if there's a particular philosophy that informs how you make choices with respect to art around these topics. And what I'm really doing is inviting you to, in a sense, maybe make explicit that the encounter between art and migration involves various kinds of choices that can be the basis for various kinds of debates or disputes. So I'm interested to hear how you think about it.
Should I go first? Since we're located inside Trampoline House, it is of utmost importance for us to communicate art that communicates to the asylum-seeking and refugee members of the house. It means that we focus on art that is produced by people who have done the journey. We're focusing not on secondary testimonies, but first-hand testimonies. in order to initiate a conversation and create a platform where migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in Denmark actually feel that they are represented by people who have tried this themselves. Of course, this sometimes involves also inviting representatives of the white privileged world. We do that always in close dialogue with artists with immigrant or refugee background.
We also have a few rules of thumb that help us when we curate. There's this one person, Kubert. We're always asking, would Kubert appreciate this? Would he understand it? Would it be helpful for him? And we're not always successful, but that says more about us than Kubert. And also, we do get a lot of requests to do out-of-the-house projects. And we always ask, is this beneficial to the people in the house? Not in principle, but to the real people. And if it's not, then we're not interested in this collaboration. So we do have some guidelines in a way, yeah.
We curate primarily for audiences with migrant, immigrant, and refugee backgrounds or experiences. That's why we are located inside Trampolin House. The Trampolin House community is our primary audience, and we curate with them in mind. It has been, for both of us, a very healthy process of unlearning unnecessary, curatorial, difficult discourse to try to be able to communicate very complex issues and structures in a straightforward way, and we've received a lot of help and learning from people in the house, if that makes sense. We produce catalogs for each exhibition, and we also do a lot of work to try to have wall text accompanying each work. Again, we're trying to write from the stomach out to unpack difficult essays like you guys' work, so that it becomes accessible for people who are living in the deportation centers, who are living in the asylum centers, and to let their analyses and mobilizations inform what we do and how we curate. I hope it makes sense.
At the same time, we stressed in the presentation that we show international professional art, sort of first-class art, and it's important for several reasons. Part of it is to restore dignity. This was raised a couple of times today already. This is really high-quality art, but it also helps us to build that bridge that we would like to bridge, to build between those who seek asylum or were granted residency in Denmark and those of us who received them. Because big-name artists and many big-name artists have made the journey, open minds and hearts, and make people want to come to camp, make people want to do that journey of 20 meters, 25 meters, oh sorry, it's stormy weather, to make that journey through the house, to get to camp, and see the exhibitions. And they also have to journey out again when they've seen the exhibitions, and hopefully they will stay around, they will start to engage in dialogue with the people that use the house. It's a very hectic environment when the house is open. There's a lot to engage in.
On camp, we often were met with the presumption that we showed therapeutic art by refugees and asylum seekers, amateur, self-taught artists, and our insistence on showing professional practices is in fact to say that that there's a tradition of engaging these issues aesthetically and that we want to represent that work. It's also to get away from the very dangerous trap of reducing refugee and migrants to their lived experience, to solely bear witness to what happened to them and not create a space where they analyze and they mobilize and they criticize.
Thank you so much for that, Frederikke. I'm intrigued by the idea of space as well, but I think I'll, and I can see that there are a couple of questions as well from you, but let's keep that for later, and I'll invite now Mahmoud Keshavars for the next session. Yes.
Yeah. Great. Our next speaker is Nora Qadim. Nora is an associate professor of political science at the University of Paris 8 Vincent Saint-Denis. I'm not a French speaker, so. And a researcher at the CRASPA laptop. She recently published a book on EU-Morocco negotiation on migration policy. I'm gonna translate it on my own because my French sucks. So that would be, the book title would be Asymmetrical Governance of Migration, the case of Morocco and European Union. Her research concentrates on migration policies, on the discriminations they create, and on the various forms of resistance that exist when it comes to these policies, especially in the global south. So, welcome.
Thanks, Mahmoud. Okay, I understand why people were puzzled. It's bizarre, the microphone. Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me. I'm really glad to be part of this reflection and discussion, and hope I can bring something to it. Let me start today by presenting to you two projects. In the first project, the artist interviews Wall Street traders who come from all over the world to work there. They're asked about their life story, the path that has taken them here, their motivations, successes, maybe failures or disappointments, and their hope for the future. They are then asked to pose wearing clothes and accessories from the 1920s and 30s. These photos will be used to update photos from the 1929 crisis. The portraits of today's traders will be presented together with those of the past. They will be printed out in supersized formats and presented on the facades of buildings of Wall Street. They will make the history and diverse identities of the people working there, as well as the continued uncertainty in which they live, impossible to ignore. The second project, the Patchwork House, a mobile unit for crafts led by a local artist in Berlin, will be part of the Creative Together program. Establishing the first patchwork workshop in Kreuzberg since the 19th century, the Patchwork House is inspired by the American quilting traditions and the expat community's need for objects both functional and spiritual. The patchwork tradition, after having migrated from Europe to America with the Pilgrims, will thus be reclaimed on this trip back to Europe. The slow process of quilting will help foster community and encourage those affected by exile and displacement from Trump's America to share their experiences. In a series of workshops to be held in the workspace, Berlin-based expats are invited alongside other Berlin residents to make ceremonial patchworks which will be used by the participants in a symbolic sleeping ceremony aimed at exorcising their demons and reconciling them with sound sleep. Okay. Project 3, not necessary here. How can we discuss these projects and what do they have in common? First, they are all imaginary, of course, that I made up for the purpose of today's presentation. Second, however, they're all based on real projects that have been conducted with different migrant communities in different places. The projects I jokingly presented to you feel somewhat off and absurd. But are they much more off and absurd than some of the real art projects engaging with migrants and refugees? It's unclear to me. However, it is difficult to imagine them actually happening, and what I want to wonder is why is that? The first reason, no doubt, lies in the connection between visibility and power. While art is financed by the rich or by public authorities nowadays, as well as still the rich, the choice between representing the rich benefactor or the poor, the precarious, the outcast, migrants or refugees, those commonly grouped together nowadays under the term vulnerable, the choice does not present itself in the same manner as, for example, during the European Renaissance. Artists who pursue these engagements want to give visibility to the invisible, names to the nameless, the humanity to the dehumanized. Others want to help make their voices heard through different settings. However, both the political and ethical dimensions of such an engagement are often euphemized or overlooked, mostly because some questions remain not only unanswered, but also unasked, the main one being who benefits from the work. Which brings me to the second reason why my projects seem unlikely: time and access. The focus on non-Western migrants and refugees, especially those stuck in camps or in very dire situations, rather than on more well-off migrants in better conditions, in these artworks that remain anonymous today, stems from the desire to speak of their difficulties, but also from the relative or perceived availability of some versus others. Whereas my traders or American expats in Berlin, if they were open to participation to an art project, might not have any time or be willing to give any time to it, because time is money. Other categories are seen as more willing and even welcoming anything that will distract them from their terrible living conditions. The quote disappeared, but I had a quote about boredom in the camps, and this is something that comes up regularly in articles about life in the camps. A number of press articles talk about this, and so to give them a voice or empower them. However, this shows a tendency also to value people's time differently, as well as what involvement in an art project can bring them, often without questioning assumptions about this. So these two aspects show how both political and practical aspects direct the attention of artists towards certain people who are incidentally, while being celebrated as heroic and or universal, turned into the object of the art. As has been discussed by Emma Chubb in her analysis of what she calls migrant Orientalism, and that I believe is one of the starting points for this workshop, specifically non-Western illegal migrants in contemporary artworks and critical analysis might actually marginalize more than empower them. Now, I'm not an artist, I'm not an art critic or a curator, and we've heard today about great art projects actually that have asked all these questions, but I am a social scientist, and this has often led me to wonder about the same things while at an exhibition or while reading a book or an article about migrants. Mainly questions about how to interpret the piece, but also about why people were represented in this or that way, or about what they had gained from that interaction, or what had become to them, while I knew what had become of the artist, but not of the people in the piece. In other terms, I sometimes have the feeling that the border spectacle, to use Nick de Genova's expression, created by the securitization of migration and borders, has had an attentive audience, and that the attention given by the most attentive audience has sometimes been voyeuristic, by which I mean focused on the sordid or on the spectacular or scandalous aspects, and by turning it into art to a certain extent, taking some pleasure in it. Another similarity between the artist and the social scientist engaging in work with migrants is that we become migrant eaters. The expression comes from Ruben Anderson's book, Illegality Incorporated, I think Inc. stands for Incorporated, in which he describes his travels from West Africa to Morocco to Spain to Warsaw to anthropologically examine the whole system of production of illegality and its effects. In his first chapter, he recounts an interview with Mohamedou, a repatriate in Senegal. Mohamedou starts by asking him rather directly, "What can you offer us? And what do you want?" Which, as it turns out, is the result of having received already too many visitors. He explains that a lot of people have passed by here, but every time they go back to Europe, there's nothing. Ils mangent sur nous, or they eat from us or on us. This is Anderson acknowledging that he is part of a system. We study migration mostly because it has become such a visible topic, constructed as a political problem to which research financing is attached. And studying it, even to say that it should not be viewed in itself as a problem, we are reinforcing the idea that it is to be studied and hence potentially a problem. As such, research becomes part of a whole system where the migration industry has become the migration control or the migration management industry, as well as potentially the migration research or the migration arts industry. I'm not so much interested in giving moral or ethical judgments or evaluation of existing art pieces, which is why I don't cite many artworks, though I'm sure you are thinking of some as I speak, as in listing possible questions that I think should be at least asked, even though there might not be any satisfying answer to them. I do not mean that to say that nobody should work on migration, on migrants, because it is ethically unsound. Rather, I want to examine the dilemmas that artists and researchers alike are faced with, as well as humanitarian actors who are particularly caught in the intertwinement of compassion and repression that is brought about by increasingly restrictive border control. These dilemmas, I think, can be, or some of these dilemmas at least, can be summarized here. Visibility versus invisibility. If you focus on migrants, you provide the invisible with a platform for visibility, but at the same time you constrain them within a set of representations, making them the objects. The alternative is not focusing on them in this very two-sided only alternative. The alternative would be not focusing on them and thus accepting their invisibility or letting it be. It's the similar dilemma that is providing by giving a voice or listening to the voices. This dilemma is about the difficulty of actually listening and hearing, the automatic limits that come with selecting who to work with. Should that discourage any attempt at working on or with migrations or migrants, thus reinforcing the silencing of migrants' voices? Or should we focus on the system that creates the situation, which is, by the way, what I have been doing in my research? Instead, you make the victims of the system still somewhat invisible while doing that. Do you focus on representation, talking for and about people, or do you try to set up a collaboration which will inevitably be flawed by the practical constraints and difficulties of setting up a truly egalitarian collaboration? How do you eschew exploitation in this context? In order to avoid this, do you make the art about the artist instead, if the artist is not from the community or is not a migrant themselves? Do you make it about the artist, about their path of discovery or even the discovery of their own privilege, but run the risk of being self-centered or entitled? Or do you make it about the people only, but then run the risk of being exploited? And similarly, are you interested in describing migrants and refugees as the same as us, humanizing them and insisting on universality, but running the risk of minimizing both the problems they are confronted with and the privileges of others? Or do you describe them as heroic in the face of these problems, or focus on discovering their cultures and traditions, thus running the risk of othering? These might seem like slightly exaggerated extremes in which compromises can be found, thankfully, but they show the difficulty of engaging with the topic of migration. Of course, I'm not the first person to reflect on these issues, and I want to point to two resources that I think can be very useful, and I'm more than happy if you can point to others. The first one is a list made in 2015 by RISE, Refugees, Survivors and Ex-Detainees, the first refugee and asylum seeker organization in Australia to be run and governed by refugees, asylum seekers and ex-detainees. Which is 10 things you need to consider if you are an artist not of the refugee and asylum seeker community looking to work with our community. You can Google that very easily to find it. The first thing they say is process, not product. We are not a resource to feed into your next artistic project. Second thing, critically interrogate your intention. Something we heard also in the video, the heart is in the good place, but why are you actually doing this? Our struggle is not an opportunity, or our bodies a currency by which to build your career. The Third thing, realize your own privilege. What biases and intentions, even if you consider these good intentions, do you carry with you? 4, participation is not always progressive or empowering. 5, presentation versus representation. 6, it's not a safe space just because you say it is. 7, do not expect us to be grateful. 8, do not reduce us to an issue. 9, do your research, know the solidarity work already being done and spend some time. 10, art is not neutral and there is always something inherently political to talking about migration. Another resource is relatively newer, is a toolkit for creative arts, migration and advocacy created by Arts for Advocacy, an interdisciplinary research project funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund at the University of Edinburgh and Kiel. It seeks to develop, I'm reading from the website, it seeks to develop innovative, interdisciplinary and participatory arts-based methods to facilitate critical engagement and advocacy relating to forced displacement in Morocco. The toolkit is the result of workshops held in Glasgow and Rabat during festivals, during which artists, migrant leaders, researchers, NGO practitioners, curators, and others met to discuss challenges and ways forward in creative engagement on displacement. It comprises 4 sections, one on collaboration with diverse organizations and actors, the other one on ensuring meaningful participation, creative processes and representations, and a 4th one on advocacy. Each of these sections starts with a list of challenges. This is the one from the section on collaboration, which lists, for example, the challenge of identifying your own privileges and positions of power, what are the implications of biases and assumed hierarchies, which I believe is interesting for art projects, but also for collaborative research projects as well as NGO work, where these power relationships between Western NGOs and non-Western local NGOs are often unquestioned. And so I find this fascinating, and I mostly want to continue kind of in this vein. The first thing I want to examine maybe is money and power, which is often not made visible in the way the art is presented. As I said earlier, I believe there's now a migration study and migration art industry, as well as a migration industry and a migration management industry. The fact that our actions as artists, researchers, and even activists to a certain extent fit within this market pushes us towards a questioning of this market. In other terms, acknowledge our privilege if we can fund our career by studying or representing or working on migration. Acknowledge the power relations that this funding might create with other people who are or become our objects or collaborators in project. Make this power structure also clear. Try to share decision-making powers with collaborators if we call it a collaboration. Do not pretend that decisions are collective if they're not. Also, make the conditions of production visible. In exhibitions, I have found myself wondering if the people participating in projects had been paid or not. And I don't know if this is something, there are artists here, is it something that would be possible to indicate, you know, on the little cartel? Is that called a cartel in English? A little paper on the side, a little. I know it doesn't function in the same way, but you know, I would like to know about this. If a piece produces money or career, does it produce something tangible for everyone involved? I understand that some people might volunteer because they're happy to and they're bored and so on, but that should be clarified, as well as the amount of time spent with the artist. Also, equality in naming. I've noticed many projects where the migrants are just referred to as by a first name, not without a last name. I find this, I understand that there might be many reasons for this, but it might sometimes appear infantilizing when the artist or others are fully named. There are the constraints, but maybe if there's a fake first name, there can also be a fake last name. Or make the reasons for whatever choice more clear. This leads me to a second issue, risk, which has been mentioned by several participants before me. The fact that some people prefer to remain anonymous highlights that they might be at risk should their identity be revealed, what is the risk and for whom is an important question. The Arts for Advocacy Toolkit suggests, for example, to tackle issues of confidentiality, harm, and anonymity with participants without deciding for them whether their identities should be hidden or exposed. Try to be conscious that people might face risks that we are not facing, of course, and here I could talk about a project led by some colleagues, a collaborative project, but I think I should go a bit faster. And third, accept refusal to participate and learn from it. Why is someone refusing to participate? And if there's if you understand the reason, maybe that might help you go forward in the project and with other people. A third group of questions, I think, relates to participation and collaboration. What exactly does the project entail? What do I expect from collaborators or participants? Do I expect people to give me their time? What can I offer in return, including my own time? And as we have seen, the projects today result from long-term engagement with people, with the topic, so it's not about just artistic tourism into migration. Do I see people as collaborators or as participants? Have I made this clear to everyone involved in the project? If the project involves a practice in which I'm an expert and they're not, how do I avoid being patronizing? Why am I asking them to participate? Am I trying to outsource authenticity, to use Claire Bishop's expression about participatory art, by asking people to perform their own identity, to play their own identity? And finally, last aspect, what am I trying to say and how can or will it be interpreted? Back to the art is not neutral stance. There is a lot of empathy and emotion involved with working on migration that can lead to sometimes insensitive work that just displays the emotion of the artist or of others. But a piece of art cannot be simply human and not political. We need to acknowledge that we are doing, that what is being done is political. It's all very well to reach a broad audience, but what if the work, while rendering visible, participates in othering as well? So we need to pay attention to potential conditions of reception of the work. And finally, I would like to conclude with discussing the fact that many of the existing discussions on the ethics or insensitivity of art engaging with migration focuses on pieces produced by people who have themselves experienced migration or in-betweenness. People like Ai Weiwei or Bushra Khalidi or Ito Barada or Zeynep Sedira. Interestingly, I think less so on Adrienne Pachi's work, for example. Maybe part of the outrage in these discussions come from an assumption that because of their personal histories, they should be more sensitive. However, that's not necessarily the case. This brings an additional dilemma for people who are in these situations. Do you focus on your own story or look at others and go beyond? There is a risk of being accused of being an artist with a small scope, focused on the personal, or with the risk of self-othering by presenting a story that can appear stereotyped. But if you go beyond, then you need to acknowledge that all the previous questions asked are still relevant. You should also still ask all these questions. To question the use of one's identity in the process of making and presenting a piece, is using implicitly or explicitly, is one's identity used implicitly or explicitly as a legitimizing tool in the process? And finally, there's a need to acknowledge that the personal story of an artist is not the same or even similar to that of all migrants or refugees, and to acknowledge the privilege of the present position of the artist in many cases. I'm sure these are all more questions than answers, and maybe it's just a big rant on my part after actually having heard the presentation of many great projects. So it's not directed at those projects, but it's really more about moving forward in art as well as in research, and there's a lot of collaborative research, an increasing number of collaborative research, not between migrants and others and us, but actually between different types of disciplines, which I think can also help in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Any question? Come.
I was so quick. Thank you so incredibly much. Very, very inspiring and thought-provoking. I'm working in a lot of refugee and migrant communities myself, and you raised the issue of boredom, right? So I'm a social scientist as well, so I'm absolutely not an artist by any means. But you raised it as sort of in passing, but I was wondering if you could extend a bit on this thing, because I think that's one of the few things that is so hard to capture, also when you try to go into collaborations with artists or photographers in my case or so, because it's a part of reality in all over the world, I think, with being immobilized. Yet we are so incredibly focused on drama and moments of drama that we can somehow spectacularize, right? Or write about, and so on. So I just wanted you to.
Well, I can't really speak to it directly, but there's a bit of a few anthropologists who have worked or brought up this issue of boredom. Mostly actually also at home before traveling, and actually anthropologists who have said that the trip is not necessarily about this economic plan of finding the El Dorado or whatever, but just about having an adventure because you're bored at home, so leaving home as a way of, and as you say, being immobilized, bringing about a lot of boredom. Yeah, and as I was saying, I've read a lot of articles that mention this boredom, but it's difficult, I'm sure, to capture. But I'm sure art would be really good for capturing that, if someone wanted to do that.
There's a researcher called Victoria Canning. She doesn't talk about boredom in the camp. She talks about stolen time, which I think is a more accurate term than boredom, because we're talking about forced pacification and victimization. So it's really this feeling of wasting months and years of your life of having been held back. So I think the term stolen time is amazing, because it is a structural moment of stealing somebody's potential. I want to thank you also for a really, really wonderful, informative presentation. We will take it home with us. And I want to also thank you for bringing up this attention to the fact that when you approach as a researcher or a non-refugee artist or migrant, a refugee or migrant, you are researcher or artist number 500, number 1,000, that there are so many before us coming and asking the same questions, asking people to open up to the most traumatic moment of their lives, and not giving anything back necessarily. I think Trembling House is very much a response to this idea that we had an obligation to stay together as a community and to create a permanent platform for a shared space where we can campaign and struggle and support each other. So this idea that we remember that we have to give something back for the information, we have to contribute to the struggle for real.
Thank you. Thanks for the reference. I was actually quite uncomfortable with the term boredom and felt like, well, there's all this time that's being created, and we, researchers or artists, we come and we want to use that time that's being made available, sort of forcibly. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. So we move to next speaker. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Sandro Mezzadra, who I have the pleasure and honor of counting not only as a colleague but a friend for many years. Sandro is a professor of political theory at the University of Bologna. Recently relocated to a new department whose name is so long and complicated that I won't try to reproduce it.
Department of the Arts.
Department of the Arts.
And the subtitle.
With many subtitles. But among many other things that Sandro's done in his scholarly career, migration has become a prominent thematic that organizes much of his work. Perhaps best known for his co-authored book with Brett Nielsen, Border as Method, or the Multiplication of Labor, from a few years ago. Sandro's been working both as an activist and a scholar for many years on themes related to migration, and is prominently associated with the concept of the autonomy of migration. Most recently, also the author of a book in Italian that was just translated into English called In the Marxian Workshops, which is very new, and so also something to take a look at. But with no further ado, welcome, Sandro.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you to all the organizers for inviting me. I will speak about an activist project I am currently involved with, the Mediterranean project. Back in October, on the 3rd of October, the 5th anniversary of the shipwreck that was mentioned by Charles Heller before we launched a migrant rescue ship in the central Mediterranean. I must say that I feel a bit guilty, just a bit, for being here today, because there is a quite important crisis going on in the Mediterranean in these hours. You may know that Sea-Watch 3 rescued 47 migrants 5 days ago. Now weather conditions are getting worse and worse, and the ship is heading towards Sicily, where Mediterranean, our project, is involved in an attempt to organize kind of welcoming of the 47 migrants in the city of Palermo, if the ship will be able to get there. And you may know that Italian ports are closed, so there is a kind of harsh conflict going on in these hours, because the mayor of Palermo, Leo Luca Orlando, is working with us and is kind of looking forward to welcoming the 47 migrants on board Sea-Watch 3. The rescue of these 47 migrants last week was part of a chain of events, among them a major shipwreck. 117 migrants died between Friday and Saturday in the central Mediterranean. And we can take this shipwreck as a tragedy itself, but at the same time also as a symptom of kind of catastrophic situation, particularly in the central Mediterranean, after the Italian government started a real war on NGOs last summer. This is a kind of predicament that is particularly acute in the central Mediterranean, but also the western Mediterranean these days, but it resonates at the global level. 2 days ago, volunteers of the NGO No More Deaths were convicted in Arizona for leaving food and water in the harsh Sonoran desert to help refugees and migrants who cross the border between the US, Mexico and the US to survive. In India, we are witnessing mounting attacks on NGOs and human rights activists who support Rohingyas, refugees and migrants, particularly in West Bengal. The list could go on, but it was important for me to mention at least 2 instances in order to give you the idea of the global dimension of this anti-humanitarian attacks and of the ensuing predicament for migrants and refugees. On the other hand, the global landscape and seascape of migration is characterized by the persisting stubbornness of migrants challenging borders at sea and on land. We witness every day this stubbornness in the behaviors of migrants and refugees residing in the Mediterranean who refuse to be brought back to the detention centers in Libya. But over the last weeks, we also experienced the migrant caravans from Central America to Mexico and toward the US, kind of powerful instantiation of the autonomy of migration about which both Nicholas and I and many other friends have been writing over the last years. I think that it is precisely in the field of tension between this autonomy of migration and the criminalization of humanitarian intervention that we have to think of migration in the current global predicament. Criminalization of humanitarian intervention or dehumanitarian as Charles was saying before. This is a development that instantiates kind of rupture, break with past developments at borders in many parts of the world. Past developments were characterized by an environmental turn of what Didier Fassin terms the humanitarian reason. And we have been criticizing critically analyzing this governmental turn of the humanitarian reason over the last couple of decades. In Borderless Method, the book I wrote with Brett Nielsen, we kind of emphasize the fact that human rights and humanitarianism had become key internal elements in migration and border regimes. And while we were carefully pointing to the kind of potentialities that this governmental turn of the humanitarian reason opened up for migrants and refugees, we were also criticizing the kind of gaze that humanitarianism promotes and that the governmental turn of humanitarian reason inscribes onto the border regimes. Our critique was part of a kind of collective critical discourse. Susan Sontag, for instance, famously emphasized the fact that the humanitarian gaze reduced the other to someone to be seen and not someone that returns the gaze. More generally, humanitarianism has nurtured a fundamental asymmetry between the rescuers and the people to be rescued. As Didier Fassin writes, quote, those at the receiving end of humanitarian attention know quite well that they are expected to show the humility of the beholden rather than express demands for rights. So just a couple of keywords and quotes in order to conjure up the critique of humanitarianism that many of us have been collectively articulating over the last years. At the same time, I think there is a need to stress that we are talking about kind of dynamic processes that cannot be taken as crystallized. Again, I appreciated the way in which Charles was talking about this topic, speaking of humanitarianization of the border regime. It's not so beautiful as a word, but it gives the idea of a process. And if we can analyze the humanitarianization of the border regime, we can also take into account the possibility of a dehumanitarianization of the border regime itself. And this is what we are confronted with nowadays, as I was saying at the beginning, not only in the Mediterranean, in the central Mediterranean, in a place like Italy, but at the global level. So back to last year in June, when the Minister of Interior, who is the real boss of the Italian government, Matteo Salvini, announced in a very rhetorical way through Twitter and Facebook that Italian ports are closed, we were starting to discuss about the way in which we had to react. We, meaning old friends, old comrades who had a shared political experience in social movements for many years. So we were asking ourselves, what is to be done? Let's organize a demonstration, let's go in front of the court, and let's try to build alliances, okay? Let's write a code, let's write articles. Of course, all these things have to be done. But we had the impression that the kind of exceptional situation we were living through demanded us to invent something new. And so we were starting to ask ourselves, why do not we buy a ship? Something like, crazy today, because no one has any experience. We had no idea about what it meant to buy a ship. A bit of Don Quixote as a kind of model for political activism. But at the end of the day, we were able to buy a ship. And we started what we call an ANG, an NGA, is in Italian, a non-governmental action. I mean, we stress the fact that we are not an NGO, although we cooperate with several NGOs, including Sea-Watch. But I think it is important to reflect upon this idea of a non-governmental action that for me, in a way, refers back to a famous speech delivered in front of the General Assembly of the United Nations in Geneva in 1981 by Michel Foucault. A speech in which Foucault was kind of claiming the necessity of developing a new right, a different right, the right to intervene in front of the suffering of men and women, a right opposed and potentially also kind of conflicting with the right of sovereignty. Foucault was, as you may know, very much influenced by Bernard Kouchner at the time, the founder of MSF. And my question is whether it is possible to hark back to that speech by Foucault, liberating the new right he was talking about from the legacy of Bernard Kouchner. In other words, I think that we can reappropriate this idea of claiming an autonomous right of intervention in conditions of exception that are more and more widespread at sea and on land, without replicating the whole history and pitfalls of humanitarianism, of the humanitarian reason. You know, humanitarianism is usually not particularly appreciated in critical kind of gatherings as this one. I suppose, I repeat, I have been criticizing humanitarianism myself for many years. And often a connection is made between humanitarianism and humanism, and the critique of humanism, the kind of point of honor of many critical thinkers. The kind of slogan of the day in many critical discourses is the post-human. And Rosi Braidotti asked me and Brett Nielsen to write an entry for a big book, Lexicon of the Post-Human, that came out a couple of months ago, an entry on Lampedusa. And we wrote the entry, but I was saying to Rosi, you know, what strikes me is a slogan that resonates in many migrants' demonstrations. And this slogan is, we are humans. So let's try to think through this kind of claim to humanity that is so widespread among migrants and refugees. And let's ask ourselves whether it is not possible to connect that slogan with a long history of anti-colonial and anti-racist theories and movements. If you take, for instance, the history of African American theories and movements in the US, well, this history is crisscrossed by kind of violent reaction to dehumanization that ends up claiming kind of reinvention of the human. The founding text of African American political thought is David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world, 1830, that is precisely characterized by this claim, we are human. And let's jump 130 years, let's read again Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, where you have precisely this powerful image of the human as a stake, as a battleground, where kind of practice of animalization of the colonized, of dehumanization that characterize colonial rule are opposed and contested by a set of political practices that point precisely to the possibility of reinventing the human. So I think that in the Mediterranean nowadays, as well as many other border spaces elsewhere in the world, we can see a kind of repetition of the battle described by Fanon. The Mediterranean is a site where the human is massacred every day. And maybe that it is also the site where the human can be reinvented. And to reinvent the human, for me, in a conjuncture that is characterized by a kind of nationalist backlash, even within some parts of the left, cannot but mean to reinvent internationalism. So it is in this kind of direction that I try to arc back to Foucault's speech in 1981 and to his powerful claim for kind of autonomous right of intervention, which makes for a challenge to state monopoly of intervention in conditions of emergency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandro. I was inspired by your remarks to think about the ubiquity of the slogan, "No human being is illegal." And I wondered whether, in the face of the criminalization of solidarity that we've seen escalate in the last 2 years or so, whether you would propose something like no humanitarian act is illegal. But of course, immediately that begs the question of the humanitarian border, where no humanitarian border ceases to be a border. So this kind of contradictory way in which humanitarianism is situated both in relation to these new formations of policing and enforcement of borders, at the same time as they become a stake that needs to be reinvented, in a sense, along the lines of the activist project that you're describing, which is self-conceived, I believe, not as an act of charity and that kind of humanitarianism, but as an act of solidarity. So I wanted to just invite you to reflect on that.
Yes, you got the point. We already had a couple of conversations on the topic. I prefer to speak for once in very concrete terms, referring to our project. What we stress is the political nature of our intervention at sea. Saying the political nature means not to accept the idea that humanitarian intervention is above all neutral and technical. And this has been a kind of dogma for humanitarianism since the late 1970s. Contending that our intervention is a political intervention also means that we emphasize the link, the need to build bridges between sea and land. We don't understand our intervention as limited to an area of humanitarian emergency. And this attempt to build multiple bridges between sea and land corresponds in a very concrete sense to an attempt to contribute to a reorganization of migrant and anti-racist activism in Italy and possibly beyond the Italian borders. We are, for instance, discussing a lot with people who manage squats where migrants and refugees live in many Italian cities. We are trying to consolidate a network capable to develop autonomous welcoming initiatives in order to respond to a usual question. Okay, it's important to rescue people in distress at sea, but once you have rescued them, what do you offer to them? Of course, you don't have anything to offer. but we have at least the project to contribute to consolidating this network of welcoming initiatives, particularly at the level of the cities in Italy and beyond that already exist. So these are some ways in which we try to instantiate solidarity and to keep a distance from charity.
Other questions or comments? Charles?
First, one brief comment and then maybe a question, kind of two distinct points. Thinking about this process of repoliticization of humanitarian practice. Now, in fact, one of the most useful and inspiring texts by Foucault for me in my own work is a very short text called Preface to Transgression. It's a beautiful short text in which he describes the relation between the limit and transgression as a line that is crossed and that moves or even evaporates as soon as it is crossed. Right? So you can think about this as the relation between power and resistance. Right? Resistance, practices of transgression are constantly transgressing norms, borders, etc., and thus transforming them. Right? Governmental practices reposition themselves. And so we also constantly need to reposition ourselves to regain the political edge. Now, if we think of the process of the NGO deployment in the Mediterranean, at first it was very transgressive. When MSF arrived, they said, "You bastards left, so we have to come and we denounce your retreat and we call you to come back." 1 month later, there was UNAFRMED, an EU anti-smuggling operation operating in the same space. And a form of complementarity emerged, right? So NGOs were rescuing migrants. Just after them, boats would be blown up to smoke by UNAFRMED's warship. In that sense, you really had Michel Agier's description of the left and the right hand of empire, right? And I remember very well meetings with NGOs saying, okay, we have this complementarity, normalization, how do we regain the political edge? In this case, I think part of this occurred not by NGOs changing their practice, but by power, government changing its own practice towards the criminalization of solidarity. By doing exactly the same thing, solidarity at sea became a highly transgressive practice, right? So sometimes it's not only you who have to reposition yourself, but the same practice can become very transgressive when the limit moves back towards you, in a sense. Interestingly, I think in this moment, you had kind of two options. One was SOS Méditerranée, which tried to kind of depoliticize even further its discourse, right? To kind of escape the wrath of the state. The other, I think, was Mediterranean and Sea-Watch, etc. I affirm their transgressive dimension. So this was kind of just the comment. The other is much more brief. I'm really curious and inspired by this kind of reclaiming of humanity, humanism. I'm wondering if how can we think of this maybe also processually, i.e. less humanity as an essence, but think of a process of humaning, of creating and claiming commonality. And how can we do this in a way that does not erase difference and conflict, right? I mean, somehow the risk of the category humanity is to erase class conflict, for example, racial difference, etc. Right? How do we maintain those dimensions of difference and conflict, even as we claim?
This is the quick and easy question. also a very difficult question. I would like to have more time to expand on it. Definitely, I'm not thinking of the human in terms of essence. I'm thinking of the human in terms of potentiality, you know, following the lead of classical modern European materialism from Spinoza to Mountz. But I'm also aware of the fact that you have to handle with care the notion of humanity, precisely for the reasons that you were mentioning. It's not only the question of identity, it's more the question of universalism and pitfalls. But in order to tackle this question, we would really need more time. Very happy to do that. Maybe tomorrow.
One more.
Thank you so much, Sandro. Whenever there is a debate on refugees and migration in public media in Denmark, you'll have like the anti-immigrant proponent, and you'll have the pro-immigration proponent. And the pro-immigration proponent is always, or very often, characterized as a hogwash, a humanist. It's a derogatory term. I think it stems back to Hitler and Mein Kampf, talking about the humanist as naive, the humanist as going too far in her solidarity. What do we do with a term, a derogatory term like that? How do we reclaim humanism not as something naive, but as solidarity, as you were saying?
No, this is again a very important and also difficult question. It is difficult maybe at another level. Of course, we have a similar problem in Italy as elsewhere. In Italy there is a word that is used by anti-immigrant politicians like Salvini himself. This word is buonismo. Buono means good, so it's kind of goodism. It's easy to be good, you know, this kind of stuff. And in a way, I think it is easy to answer your question in theoretical terms, because I think it is not that difficult to claim a kind of humanist legacy without being naive in theoretical terms. But then when you have to confront you know, the opponents, it is quite different. So I never use the word humanist, for instance, in public debates. I start public debates trying, particularly when I have opponents in the room, to point directly to the differences that Charles was mentioning. Questions of class, to questions of you know, even to the conflicts that are connected with migration. I really try not to promote an idyllic view of migration. But I don't have, let's say, a general answer to your question. I mean, I try to negotiate it in a tactical way according to the context. But it is important to keep it in mind. It is important to develop a perspective on migration that is not a naive perspective. I think it is crucial. So thank you for bringing up the question.
So I think that we'll Thank you, Sandro, and move to the more general discussion.